Greetings. I'm Brother Judah from the Congregation of Israel, a representative of the NMP. And today I would like to deal with a subject called polygamy. Now, we have posted the videos on polygamy, and we have one video up at the moment, and we want to fill in and more to be more precise and get into more detail about the polygamous relationship in societies. Polygamy it is popular among some, but again, we deal with religio-political education. And in saying that, when you're looking at polygamy and analyzing polygamy, in juxtaposition to monogamy, we place it in the context of the society as a whole. How does it affect the society? Many people deal with religion today. They're not really looking at the society. We teach that the Bible teaches you to look at the society, and that the kingdom of God is a order that will be established in the earth, and it will bring forth justice, equity, and peace. Now, in the book of Genesis, I would like to begin to look at this subject here, and we want to focus in on a few things, primarily the seeds of antagonism. Polygamy makes the soil fertile for the seeds of antagonism. The seeds of antagonism between woman and woman, the seeds of antagonism between woman and man, and the seeds of antagonism between husband, wife, and children. All of this could be supported by the Bible. Now we're going to take our time and look at a few things, and we're going to focus in on the polygamous relationships that people so often make mention of in the Bible. And I will argue 9 times out of 10 in these polygamous relationships as they are described in the Bible, it led to exactly what the Bible warned us about in the dangers of the polygamy. Okay, people say, well, David had multiple wives. Yes, he did, and he wasn't supposed to, because of the book or the writings of the Torah pertaining to the kings. And we will show you that I am not the only one who's making that claim, but Israelites in the back in the first century also made that same claim. Not to mention that it's in the Torah. However, if you look at all of the kings who had wives, multiple wives, what happened was exactly what the Torah said would happen, is that their heart was turned away. Now, King David repented, and maybe others repented as well, but we know of David's repentance when he made his error. We're going to show you in more detail pertaining to the kings, but we want to start in the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis lays the foundation of early society. Now, Josephus also talks about this early society. And when we're looking at the book of Genesis, you must focus in, if you will, on the society, not necessarily the characters or the individuals that is mentioned, but what kind of a society was Genesis laying, that foundation. And we show you in other scriptures and other teachings that the foundation that Genesis was laying was the foundation of egalitarianism. It was a society in which goods and resources was owned in common. When you're looking at the society in Genesis, it is a stark contrast to the society in which Moses received the law. Now, Genesis society was a society, like I said, of egalitarianism. This society, there was no hierarchy in the context of a ruling class, a subjugated people. In this society, women wasn't dependent. See, when we're looking at Genesis, women wasn't dependent on a man taking care of them. In the early society of Genesis, that man and woman were heirs to the planet. and that women and men had resources equally. As the society changed and eventually led to inequality and also the wrestling away of the inheritance of the woman. And we deal with that in other teachings as well. But it's important to understand. So when we're looking at Genesis and then we go centuries ahead to Moses, we're talking two different societies. And especially in the society in which Moses and Abraham was being introduced to us, these societies were corrupted. Now, Josephus teaches us that Cain corrupted the early society. And not only did Cain corrupt the early society, the first known record in the book of Genesis of polygamy is out of Cain's descendants, Lamech. This wasn't anything in which the Creator laid the foundations with the government of Adam that we know of, that it is written of. So when we're analyzing these two societies, we're going to show you that when we're talking about the kingdom of God, we're talking about the kingdom of God establishing justice, peace, and equity in the earth. Not a religion, not religious dogma, but its primary function is to bring peace and justice to the earth. Therefore, you cannot have inequalities. Therefore, you cannot have schisms and seditions and antagonisms. And we're going to show you in the beginning, briefly, about how it was laid pertaining to husband and wife relationships. And we're going to look into studies to show that Genesis foundations of its early society, when you understand it as an early society with Adam, it will make sense on why there was a monogamous foundation. And then when we get into when the world was corrupt, then it will actually shed light on the seeds of the polygamous institutions. Now in the book of Genesis, the first chapter, it reads that, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So we establishing in the early societies of Adam, men and women were to have dominion over the earth and all the creation. And verse 27 reads, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Men and women were co-heirs to the planet. There was no inequalities at this moment in time. There was no hierarchy at this moment in time. The seeds of hierarchy was laid after the sins. But at this moment in time, the foundation originally was man and woman to be co-heirs and cooperate in the society in which they were commissioned to bring forth. Men and women, they were to multiply. And let's see, was it needful that Adam had multiple wives to populate the earth? We will find that is simply not the case. Neither was it the case in the days of Noah, where Noah repopulated the earth, and it was just him, his sons, and their wives, and Noah's wife, which Genesis again proves to us that it is not necessary for a man to have multiple wives to populate or to bring forth children. What is necessary to repopulate the earth or to populate the earth and to have an abundance of human beings on the earth is simply to be obedient to the laws and the commandments and the statutes and regulations of the Almighty. This is what he reveals in his Torah. So the argument that you got to have multiple wives and have a big family, this isn't the case at all. And other secular information will prove this. Now, we see that he told them to have dominion. This early society, they were told to have dominion over the earth. Now we go down to Genesis, the 2nd chapter. In Genesis, the 2nd chapter, I would like to start at verse 7. It says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." All right. Now we're going to go down a little further. Verse 20. And in verse 20 it reads, "And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him." There was not found a helpmeet for Adam. And the Lord, verse 21, "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs, closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he woman, and brought her unto man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore," notice carefully, "therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." Or as the Messiah put it, "They twain shall be one flesh," or "those two shall be one flesh." And it's important to realize what foundation is being laid to build the society. The foundation of any society is the family. The family unit is the foundation of the society. It is the cornerstone of the society. If the family is out of whack, then the society is out of whack. So what we find here is that the Creator is laying a foundation of building this early society. And this early society is to be an egalitarian society. A society in which the earth is owned in common by all men who shall populate it. Namely called Adam, or mankind. It is to be shared in equity. The earth is to be shared, and its resources to be shared in equity and in justice. This is the foundations of Adam. Now many will argue, or some may argue, that, well, Moses himself had two wives. According to the biblical record, yes, Moses did have two wives, but the difficulty now lies for our friends who claim that Moses was in a polygamous relationship, is to prove that Moses had both wives at the same time. And that's where they would run into difficulty. But nevertheless, whatever it was, Moses laying the foundation of Adam. He's writing about Adam, one man, one woman. This is essential, and this is very important when you look beyond the romanticizing of the biblical text. When you look into the foundations and really what the biblical text is bringing forth, a utopia, a world of peace, a world of equity, then it begs you to look into the depth of these subjects. So to complement a society of justice and equity, we're going to prove, or we're going to show you through research and through documentations, that it's been found that it's actually monogamy that will actually bring forth a society of equity and justice. And that polygamy have proven through time and time again that it is that institution itself lays the foundation of antagonisms, it lays the foundation of strife, it lays the foundation of inequality. So therefore, it also causes us to really take into deep consideration that the first polygamous relationship recorded in the book of Genesis is found with Lamech, which is the son of Cain. Now he said, "Man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife." In other words, his family unit shall be found in love and in unity. They shall be one flesh. And so this is important. A man need to cleave unto his wife. It's something else here that the Bible will reveal to complement what we're talking about. When we talk about cleave, we're talking about to stick, to cling, to become closely attached. This is a commandment in Genesis. This is what God is requiring in the book of Genesis, that the husband and wife must become closely attached, to stick or to cling to. Okay? And there is something else that is very important in the book of Genesis, and that is when you flip over to the 3rd chapter, it reveals to us that after the mankind had fallen and began to transgress, Then the Most High placed man as a guide of the family, not as a totalitarian, not as a tyrant, not as an individual that have complete domination and control. No, simply as a guide for the protection of the woman and for the protection of the family. He is a guide. If he would only be a protective guide if he walk according to the commandments of the Almighty. But nevertheless, because of that rift that had taken place, the book of Genesis says something else here that will complement Genesis the 2nd chapter, and that is Genesis the 3rd chapter. And he explains in Genesis the 3rd chapter that in verse 16, he said unto the woman, he said, after they had transgressed, he said unto the woman, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. He shall be a guide over thee. But nevertheless, our focus at this moment in time is that her desire shall be towards her husband. So after this schism, or should I say, after this schism, the Most High is revealing something else. Not necessarily that her desire wouldn't be towards her husband before sin, but it's also revealing something to us that, in essence, that a man should cleave to his wife, and nevertheless, him cleaving to his wife, then his wife should also cleave unto him, or her desire shall be towards him. Now, this becomes extremely complicated when you bring in more than one woman. And we know that it's a complication when you bring in more than one man. Keep these Genesis principles in mind, and also the context of these principles. The background of the principles we're reading now in the book of Genesis is early egalitarian society. This is before there was any kings. This is before there was any hierarchy in the social structure. This is before there was any inequalities. This is the early foundation of an egalitarian society. And we're seeing that the foundations of an egalitarian society is being established with monogamy. And some people might not understand the importance of that. Now, when you look into the books of the apostles and prophets, we're going to reveal some other things. But now, the apostles and the prophets, they were establishing, the prophets made known about the new covenant. The apostles was establishing and became the administrators or the ministers of the new covenant. Why am I bringing this out? Because the new covenant and then the foundations of the new covenant is being made with the Creator himself, but the Creator himself now is requiring the covenant. In order for you to be under the covenant, you must allow him and submit to him to change the heart, and that the commandments and the Spirit of the Almighty must write the law upon your hearts. This wasn't necessarily a requirement of the first covenant as far as being a part of that agreement. The first covenant agreement was all you had to do was do it. That's why it says all that the Creator have said will we do. Now the Creator began to proceed and explain to the children of Israel and all those who would join unto them, well, this is how you do it. You got to do it by the heart. That's how you got to do it. But nevertheless, they just agreed they would do it, and that was that first covenant. But now under this covenant, it's more than just you saying you're going to do it. You will not be under the covenant with him unless you allow him to change the tables of the heart. Why? Because it's bringing us back into the foundations of Genesis. In order for mankind to bring in peace, equity, and justice, then his heart must be changed. And when you look at the political theories of what will bring justice and equity, as we deal with socialism and we deal with communism in our teachings, we show you that truly the essence of real communism is love towards neighbor. And in order for that to happen and to have genuine unfeigned love towards neighbor is a changed heart. So when we're looking at the new covenant, it's bringing us back to the early society, the direction it's taken us to, the new covenant. The direction it's taking us to is back to an egalitarian society where the earth could be owned and under the cooperation and under the cooperative of human beings, naturally, okay, without the need of hierarchies. Now the apostles proclaimed in Ephesians, book of Corinthians. In the book of Corinthians, I want to establish this because when we just finished reading Moses, and some people, many of us, could fall when we read in Moses if we are not reading it according to the spirit of things. If you're reading about a letter, it could confuse you. So when you're reading about the book of Moses and you're reading about polygamy, if you're reading about a letter, you might not really quite understand what the Bible is revealing about polygamy. But when you read according to the spirit of things, in which the spirit of justice, the spirit of equity, the spirit of equity and peace, then you realize that the context behind the polygamous relationships in the Bible teaches us profound lessons. But 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 2 Corinthians the 4th chapter, and in 2 Corinthians the 3rd chapter, starting at verse 4, it teaches us that the apostle was speaking on how him and the other brothers who was working in the movement did not deserve any kind of upliftment or recognition. All that they had was from the Creator, and that they should receive nothing or think that they have anything of themselves. So I'll start at verse 5, in fact. It says, "Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God, who also has made us able ministers of the New Testament." New Testament simply means the New Covenant. "Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life." Under the New Covenant, as the heart being changed, man could now read the Torah and the prophets according to the Spirit, not according to the letter. For example, in the Torah, if a man was to defile his neighbor's daughter, who was unmarried, only thing he pretty much had to do was bring forth the tokens or to pay the dowry of virgins. And therefore, the father could either choose to give him his daughter or not. But it was out of order. And if a man was to entice a maid and lay with her, and he lay with her out in the field somewhere or somewhere without the marriage covenant, there were a lot of repercussions that could take place with the family. The father would probably lose the possessions of the tokens of virginity, which are the sheets or the cloth of her virginity that happened that the parents would take during the marriage covenant, which usually would leave the sign of her virginity on the cloth, and therefore they will have proof that their daughter was a virgin. Well, they wouldn't have that if a man lied with the woman and entice her. And it would cause a lot of confusion. But you know what? By the letter, only thing he had to pay was the dowry of virgins. Now, there is no regulation on how many times he can do that before he can be punished. There is no regulation on it. So therefore, if you read it according to the Spirit, then that's fornication. If you read it according to the Spirit, you see the deprivation it causes to families and to the society. And this would automatically leads to trouble. But if you read it according to the letter, all I got to do is pay the dowry of virgins. So you got to understand the spirit of the matter. And this is what the apostles is explaining. The spirit of the matter. And as we bring out in our other teaching on polygamy, the letter says Israel can have a king. But Samuel himself, when the children of Israel confronted Samuel about a king, Samuel himself was displeased. But Samuel himself, he was a judge in Israel. As far as we know that he understood the law of Israel, that they can have a king, but nevertheless he was displeased. However, the laws say you can have a king by the letter, and it gives you regulations if you want a king, like the nations also have kings. But the Bible proves, according to the Spirit, that the Creator didn't really approve of it. So when you read the book of Samuel, you will find that Samuel was displeased. You will find that the Creator warned them about a king. And then you find that the Creator in the book of Hosea chapter 13 said he was displeased. Even though it was written in the Torah, it isn't anything he really wanted you to pursue. But if you did, because of the lust of your flesh, these are the regulations. Israel didn't need a king. And those are other teachings to show about this phenomenon of a people who didn't have a king. This is none other than bringing us back to Genesis again. Before there was hierarchy. When you look at the foundations of Israel, there wasn't any kings. It was a cooperative. You had a democracy. You had a society with no monarch, but they were ran by the elders of the villages. They were ran by the elders of the clans. It was a social network without these hierarchies of an elite or a ruling class. Samuel warned them about the rise of the elite or a ruling class in the institutions of feudalism. And this what God was warning them about, or Elohim was warning them about, because it will cause trouble. Nevertheless, they sought a king because it was in the Torah, and it brought forth trouble. But when you read it according to the Spirit, you will find that Israel didn't need a king. You will understand according to the Spirit why Samuel was displeased. People say, well, Israel got a king now. Yes. But when you look at Israel king now, he was a peasant. Totally turning upside down the institutions of the monarchs. It turns it right upside down. So the king in Israel is totally different than the traditional kingdom or the traditional king. The king in Israel was a peasant who served his students. The traditional king, he gets served. But those are the teachings. I'm simply trying to explain to you, by the letter, it can throw you off. And that's what Paul is explaining. By the letter, it kills, but the Spirit giveth life. The Spirit teaches you this, what the God of heaven requires. Now back in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 7. But if the ministration of death, speaking of the first covenant that condemned the people, was written and engraven on stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses, for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away, how shall the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? The ministration of the Spirit means the administration of the new covenant, which is according to the Spirit. That now the laws of God is in your heart, and you have a passion to love your neighbor. You have a passion to do right by your neighbor, to do right by the earth, to submit to the Creator. This is the administration of the Spirit. This administration of the Spirit will bring forth a utopia. All men will cooperate in justice and inequity. So understand what Paul is explaining, not according to religion. I know it may be difficult because everywhere we see people who use the Bible as a part of some religion. But when you look what Paul is saying out of the confines of religion and religious dogma, and you apply this to the world government and the world administrators who rule over societies, then you will realize the cooperation of man, if they be obedient according to the Spirit to love one another as themselves, then they would totally change the face of this planet and its distribution processes. There won't be any hungry. There won't be any homeless. There won't be any competition among one another. There won't be any people competing for food, competing for bread, competing for housing, and competing for wives. Yes, competing for wives. So when we're looking at the foundation of the egalitarian society, it is directly connected into the spirit of the administration of the new covenant. But when you're reading the old covenant, you can be covered under a veil of ignorance if you're not reading according to the Spirit. Brother Judah, what you talking about? Notice the Apostle Saul as he continues. Now, verse 8. How shall not the administration of the Spirit be rather glorious? For if the administration of the condemnation be glory, much more doth the administration of righteousness exceed in glory. The administration of justice. Righteousness and justice are interchangeable. So Paul is talking about this administration or administration as well of righteousness or justice. You need justice. With justice, you can't have inequality. With justice, you can't have a social hierarchy where you have some who have lost their right to be heirs of the planet. So the ministration of justice or righteousness exceeds in glory. I want to skip down a little bit. Verse 12, seeing then that we have such hope, we use great plainness of speech, and not as Moses, which put a veil over his face, that the children of Israel could not steadfastly look to the end of which is abolished. But their minds were blinded, for until this day remaineth the same veil untaken away in the reading of the old covenant or the Old Testament, which veil is done away in Christ. Well, what do you mean a veil of ignorance is done away in Christ? Not necessarily the person per se, but the spirit of the person in Christ, the personage of Christ. Once the spirit of the Christ illuminates the inward man, then the man who has been illuminated by the Spirit of Christ, which is none other than the spirit or the higher consciousness that is reached by an individual as the laws of God are being written upon his heart or his conscience. Once this began to take place, then the veil of ignorance is removed. But until that takes place, the veil of ignorance remains, and while we are reading the law and the prophets as they explain and teach under the first covenant, that veil covers the people's understanding. But he said that veil is to be done away in Christ when one turns to Christ. Verse 15 reads, but even unto this day when Moses is read, the veil is upon their heart. Nevertheless, when it shall turn to the Lord, the veil shall be taken away. Now, this is important. I want you to understand that. If you can give it a shot here, we're going to look into the spirit. Because what were we reading in the book of Genesis about the foundation of the early society? That was what Paul was making reference to as the books of Moses. Books of Moses explains and gives the law in the confines of the first covenant. So now when you read the law, you can't read it according to the first covenant. You got to read it according to the new covenant, which is according to the Spirit. So many words. That's what Paul is explaining. But now, as we're reading the Torah, which contains the law, Moses teaches us about the early society of Adam and Eve. And he brings to the very foundations that man and woman began in a monogamous relationship, and this monogamous relationship also was planted upon the earth to have dominion and equity. It means they were to be joint heirs, co-owners of the planet. So what began to happen with polygamy? All at the later foundation. What began to happen with polygamy? Now, if you don't mind, let's go now back to 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter. Now, Paul laid the foundation of the first covenant, and then he began to explain this, which we will discuss, most high willing, before we close out of here briefly again. But there was a problem that had taken place. A man slept with his father's wife. Now, you could look right past that, but that also could be significant when you look at the environment in which a polygamous environment can create. And we understand during this time where Paul was writing, polygamy was known inside of the society. And I might add, polygamy, even as it is regulated in the Torah, and as it is found in societies and civilizations, it was an institution of the wealthy. And this is supported by the Torah as well. Also, when we learn this also teaches us that polygamy, if you was to analyze it critically, is finding itself among hierarchy, among the wealthy. Now, we're going to find some things that could take place among polygamous institutions or societies that allow polygamy that has actually shown that it can lead to sexual immoralities. There's a lot of things that to be considered. A man slept with his father's wife. It's known in polygamy, in polygamous relationships as well. Because obviously, if this is his father's wife, then his father got another wife. It doesn't teach us whether his mother was living or not. It doesn't teach us that. But this is reminiscent of an incident that took place with Reuben, Jacob's son, when he lied with his father's wife. They say concubines, but there's little difference between a concubine and a wife, other than a concubine was more likely to be one of a servant, which also is teaching us hierarchy and inequality. See, when we read it, we don't really quite understand that just even concubinage is an example of the undermining of Genesis, early society of equity. We don't understand it because when we read the Bible, many of us romanticize the Bible, and we're not looking at civilization and what God is creating as a civilization to inherit the earth. They look at it as a religion. They're looking at it as institutions and religions and organizations. No. Concubinage also bear witness against polygamy, or bear witness, yes, against polygamy, as polygamy undermines the society in which God was creating in Genesis. So a man slept with his father's wife. We're going to show you, keep that, note that, because when we read some historical documents or secular documents, it's going to teach us what polygamy, it's been shown the higher rates of sexual immorality in polygamous societies and other things. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1 reads, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication or sexual immorality, let every man have his own wife, and every woman have her own husband. Let every man have his own wife. Each man have his own wife, and each woman have her own husband." Now, people may get confused with this terminology. Well, that's still her own husband. No, in a polygamous relationship, it is not her own husband. He is shared. Each co-wife shares, or the supposed co-wives shares a husband. Each woman doesn't have her own. And that's what you're looking at in every woman. Each woman do not have her own husband in a polygamous relationship. So, and therefore, Paul here, I will argue, he's undermining the polygamous institutions because Paul's destination is the early society found in Genesis, a monogamy. Because monogamy lays the foundation of equity, peace, and justice. And we're going to read this to you as far as what studies have found. So he must undermine that institution, and he is. He's undermining quite a few things: antagonisms, strife, and a whole lot of marital conflict, because in marital conflict, this weakens the fabric and the institution of family, which destroys the society. This is beyond religion and a man just having another wife. You got to go into the foundations to understand the antagonisms that is created, or the fertile ground that is laid for the seeds of antagonisms found in polygamy. Now, each have his own. People say, well, what do you mean your own? I'm going to show you what he means by own. If we go to the book of Acts, the 4th chapter, Acts chapter 4. Acts the 4th chapter. And when we go to Acts, the 4th chapter, it's something interesting here that takes place in verse 32. Everybody began to, under the new covenant, they began to create a society of egalitarianism. They began to share. So in Acts chapter 4, it is also indirectly tied into Genesis' early society of Adam. But nevertheless, our focus is something else, on their own. But it's important because it also ties into the wife too. Now look, or the institution of marriages. Now, in Acts chapter 4, verse 32, it reads, "And the multitude of them that believed, they all became part of the first covenant, were of one heart and of one soul. Their heart began to be changed, so therefore they began to love one another as themselves, and they began to create a fraternal brotherhood." And when I mean brotherhood, I mean sisters and brothers too. Okay? They were, it says, they were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them, notice carefully, that aught of the things which he possessed was his own. This is the same Greek word. None of them said that any of the things which they possessed was their own, but they had all things common. So therefore, the contrast between your own is to have things in common. Now this is the same Greek word used in Corinthians. Let each woman have her own husband. In contrast, as we find in Genesis, own compared to have it in common. So the possessions in Acts chapter 4 says, no man said that aught of the things in which they possessed was their own. Meaning, as an individual, each one as an individual. They no longer said, this is my own, but I will share it and have it in common. Well, this is the same thing Paul was saying on the other side of the spectrum here, is that now a woman should have her own husband, no longer in common. Because in a polygamous relationship, a woman has a husband in common with other women. It's not her own. You got 4 wives. Each wife doesn't have her own husband. That husband is shared. And we're going to show you yet more on why this makes sense and it lays the foundation of a solid society built on justice, equity, and peace. And this is the fundamentals of the new covenant and the ministers of the new covenant. Now, let's, if you will, go to the book of Deuteronomy and look at something here in Deuteronomy. Let's go back to the book of the law, the book of Deuteronomy. And when we go to the book of Deuteronomy, notice something carefully as we investigate polygamy in the book of the law. People say, well, it's in the Bible, in the book of the law. Right. And we already laid the foundations. That now we must read the book of the law not according to the letter, but we must read it according to the Spirit. Because the letter does what? The letter kills. But what does the Spirit do? It makes it alive. It teaches you life. It teaches you how to be prepared for the kingdom of God to be found acceptable to inherit the world. It gives us life when we understand it according to the Spirit. Now in Deuteronomy, the 21st chapter, I want to read something to you, but before I do that, I want to go into the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible. The Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, Volume 3. The Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, Volume 3. And we're going to go to Genesis, the 21st chapter. And look at this. Under marriage, in the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, under marriage, on page 280, we find polygamy. Now it reads, the term polygamy literally means many marriages. And polygamous marriage, and perhaps in a special way, when there are only 2 wives, notice carefully, when there are only 2 wives, the appearance of conflict. There we go, right away. Now, this is out of the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, and it will be supported by the Bible. it says in a polygamous marriage. People say, well, you have conflict in monogamous marriages as well. That's true. But nevertheless, the rate or the percentage of likeliness of an antagonism and conflict arising when you have now a polygamous relationship increases. Each wife you have, it increases doublefold. Conflict between you and the wives and conflict between wives and the wives. So again, in a polygamous marriage, and perhaps in a special way when there are only two wives, the appearance of conflict and dissension is apparent. One wife might be the husband's favorite, and bitter rivalry could ensue, especially if the husband showed a preference for the son of such a wife. It is significant that the common Semitic name for second wife is Tasara, the root meaning of which is show hostility towards. Again, it is significant because when in a polygamous relationship, it has been shown that even the first stages of polygamy, of bigamy, when a man has two wives, the dissension and conflict is apparent. And the root word for second wife is tasara, which means, or the root meaning means to show hostility towards. Do you see how this undermines Genesis? The Most High wasn't laying the foundation of hostility between Adam and Eve because a man was to cleave to his wife and a wife was to have desire towards her husband. And in Proverbs chapter 5, it also teaches us that a man should be ravished with the wife of his youth. And it's interesting that in polygamy, a phenomenon begins to take place. I'll read that in Proverbs. I want to go to Proverbs chapter 5. I'll read that in Proverbs because I do want to bring this out briefly. Proverbs chapter 5. Because the phenomenon that takes place in polygamy is that older men, no longer in their youth, begin to take younger women, depriving men in their youth of having a wife of youth in their youth. The older men take the younger woman, depriving the young man of finding a young wife so that they can grow together. Notice in Proverbs chapter 5, the society itself is in danger once polygamy begins to take root. That's why in the early society, we must confirm that monogamy was the true foundations to create paradise. Proverbs chapter 5. I want to throw this one in here. Proverbs chapter 5. And in Proverbs chapter 5, starting at verse 1, it reads, "My son, attend to my wisdom and bow thine ear to my understanding." Okay, now we skip down to verse 10. In fact, it says, let's keep my commandments, let strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger. And thou mourn at the last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. And say, how have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give understanding so people will not fall to regret over things that they have done. It reads, as we go further in this passage, verse 15 says, "Drink water out of thy own cistern, and running waters out of thy own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and the rivers of water in the streets, and the rivers of water in the streets." Notice this. "Let them be only thine own, and not a stranger's with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. Why? Because she have a desire towards you, and you should cleave unto her and be ravished at all times with her love, but it is the wife of thy youth. So even when we go back to 1 Corinthians, you must take into consideration now some things that the Bible didn't necessarily bring into play, but could have been there once you understand polygamy and the institutions of polygamy and how it destabilizes the society. What if, as we have found in other societies, that a man is older, he's a 50, 60-year-old man, his son is 20, and his wife, the 50 or 60-year-old man, wife is 18. And his son from another wife is 18 or 20 himself. You see the dilemma that could arise between the both of them? A young woman now subject to an older man and not a husband of her youth, and a man in youth can't find a woman of his youth because, or a woman in her youth, because the older men are taking a woman. And the older man in polygamy, once you lay the foundation of polygamy, there's no regulation. He can take how many he wants. The Torah don't tell you by the letter on how many women a man can take. Teaching us, when we read the Torah, the necessity of understanding it by the Spirit and not by the letter. So, what we find here is that the second wife can cause antagonisms. Older man taking in a younger woman can also lead to more antagonism. If the first wife is older and the second wife is younger, it can lead to antagonism between an older woman and the younger woman, and it can also lead to a problem between a young woman who is the husband of the older father, but yet the wife of the father is practically the same age as the father's son. People don't consider this when you lay in the foundations of polygamy. It hasn't been well thought out. I'm going to show you what I mean. Brother, what are you talking about? I'm going to show you what I mean, because we talk about the children of Israel, correct? And we believe that the children of Israel have been scattered all over the world, right? People talk about the children of Israel and polygamy. And many of us in this society really never seen the depth of how a polygamous society can cause destruction, especially not here in America. But let's go to Nigeria. And this is a article published on Pambazuka News by Tola Asitilu. And this is an interview with a woman named Lola Shonian. Now, Lola Shonian is an artist, a poet, and she also lives in Nigeria. Now, they talk about Nigeria being the home of the Igbo, the children of Israel, more specifically, remnants of the clans of Judah was said to be found in Nigeria, on the west coast of Africa. So, this woman that we're talking about could very well be a descendant of Israel, but nevertheless, she is going to explain to us about the polygamous institutions in Nigeria firsthand. Her herself being a woman who came out of a polygamous relationship, meaning from her parents. Okay? Her parents were polygamous. Now, Miss Shonian, or Lola, I'll use the name Lola, was asked a question. One question she was asked was, it says, does Lola ever come across women who defend polygamy? Immediately, Lola said, no, never. In fact, she says the only ones who might, if I did run across any, the only ones who might defend polygamy are Muslim women who say Islam allows it. But of course, the Quran says if you are going to take more than one wife, you have the if you're going to take more than one wife, you have to be perfectly equitable. In other words, you got to show equity. And Lola would show that's not possible either, in real time. Okay. And she says, so where they take that to mean, yes, it's okay for a man to have more than one wife. So she's saying that the Muslim woman takes this, since the Quran says you're going to have more than one wife, you got to be equitable. So Muhammad put in the Quran regulations. And so Lola saying where they take that to mean, or the Muslim women take that to mean, it's okay for a man to have more than one wife. The side that they're not looking at is just how difficult it is. Now, this is a woman who lives in a country that allows polygamy, and her parent or her father was a polygamist. Wouldn't it do you well to take some type of information from this woman, who probably have more experience, than we do? And I mean truly more experience, okay? Empirical experience, firsthand. She said they're not looking at the difficulties of it. Actually, it's impossible to have 4 women and to treat them exactly the same. For one, if you have 4 women, there are only 7 days in a week. Physically, it becomes impossible as the man grows older to accommodate the duties of marriage with multiple women. One of the women, if not several of the women, will be deprived. This is just natural physiology. Nevertheless, Lola asked this. Now remember what we read in the dictionary. Polygamous relationships in the Interpreted Dictionary of the Bible. Polygamous marriage, perhaps in a special way, when there are only 2 wives, the appearance of conflict and dissension is apparent. And he also adds in his dictionary, it is significant that the common Semitic name for a second wife is Tasara, which root meaning means to show hostility towards or to vex. Now look what Lola said. Look what Lola says. Lola Shorty from Nigeria. She reads, it's funny. When you talk to women, they understand my point of view immediately. My mother came from a polygamous home as well. Everyone knows a woman who's been a wife in a polygamous household, especially in Africa. Lola grandparents were polygamous, I believe she's saying. But nevertheless, notice carefully what Lola, Miss Shonian said. Everyone knows a woman who's been a wife in a polygamous household, especially in Africa. And, quote again, and they know how bitter they are. She said it's readily known. The bitterness of women in polygamous relationships. Now this is being said from a woman who is in Africa and Nigeria, in which polygamy has been allowed, and therefore she has experience, empirical experience, or empirical evidence from her experiences of her parents, grandparents, and the society at large, that in a polygamous society, A woman is known because of how bitter they are. We're going to show you why the Bible will support this. They've all seen this transformation. They've seen polygamy transform women. You have a beautiful, lovely young woman. I'm still quoting back from Lola. She said, you have a beautiful, lovely young woman. They become a wife of a polygamous household, and they change completely. Not because they want to, but because in that small family setup, they have to become monsters to survive, or else you will be beaten down, or you could be killed as well. Sometimes it's that bad. Testimony. So you've got to stick up for yourself. You got to find ways to be the bigger blank, or the bigger B, according to her language, than the next one. And you've got to make your own kids really defensive. See how it's disrupting the family? Sometimes these things are completely outside the ordinary personality of the person who's doing them, which is very sad. In other words, it is out of character. This young woman unchanged because of the condition of inequality in the polygamous relationship she's been put in. And we're going to show you what we're talking about as inequality. And because you have all these children and just this one father, and they've got to get this man's attention, they'll do anything. They grow up being very competitive. So women understand immediately. So what do we find polygamy bring forth? Competition. We find polygamy bringing forth the deterioration of the relationship between women and women and men. And it's also deteriorating the relationship between a father and his children, because once you have so many children by different wives, it become competitive and they're fighting to get attention. Now you see the remnants of this in adulterous relationships that we call in this society, where men have multiple women by different children. It causes a lot of discord. Because of the root of the Semitic word of second wife is vex, or to show hostility towards. Now this is what Lola brought to the table. I'm going to bring a couple more witnesses to the table. And this is out of an article, Monogamy, by the Monogamy Bible, Monogamy Bible, one man, woman, and creation. I'm not going to read this article per se. I want to read the comments. And a couple of comments I'm going to read is going to support what we're reading here as far as the hostility and antagonism that arise out of polygamy. Therefore, this hostility antagonism undermines Genesis that we started with in this discussion. Keep in mind what we dealt with Adam. Now we're reading the undermining. So why would it be hostility? Because Genesis, the 3rd chapter, verse 16 says that a woman's desire shall be towards her husband. Therefore, it will inherently bring competition among the women. Okay? It will also to get the man's attention, because they all desire him. It will bring hostility towards the women because of this competition, and it will deteriorate their relationships between one another. Now, under the reader's comments, Carrie R. That's their name. Carrie R. Or R. Carrie. This comment reads, "Thank you for your article. I ran across it while researching what God really has to say about monogamy. We live and work in an African culture that is largely polygamous." And this is what we just finished reading from Lola, who also was a Nigerian, Lola Shoynian, confirming the change and the hostility in a polygamous relationship and the bitterness of women in a polygamous relationship. So our Carrie is explaining we live and work in an African culture that is largely polygamous. We didn't really encounter it where we lived previously, but now it is a prominent issue with those to whom we minister. We consistently have people asking for prayer for problems that are consequences of polygamy. Unquote. Another comment, antagonisms we're finding, contention, discord, rivalries, strife. That's why the apostle said what? One man, each man have his own wife, each woman have her own husband. He's undermining this institution of strife and antagonisms that the Creator regulated. But in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, he showed you what he wanted. Noah repopulated the earth, and he showed you that's what he wanted. And the Essenes will confirm this same argument out of the Dead Sea Scrolls about monogamy being the proper foundation of society. So this is Kevin May. He reads, some cultures other than Islamic today still accept polygamy as the community's means of providing for widows. Well, that's not necessary because Moses said that the community must provide for widows. A widow being provided for doesn't mean that she must be thrust into a polygamous relationship, but that's how it turned into nowadays. Okay? In the early society of Adam, women they didn't depend on men for help. In early societies, when women needed help and they were widows, they did not need a man to provide for them. It was the duty of the clan, the village, the society. All right? Nevertheless, I'll continue to read. Numerous men in the village where we live thus had a second wife. The reason why he says is because of the Levirate law. And the Levirate law itself is when a young man or a man takes his brother's wife to bring forth a son or to bring forth a child. Later on, they begin to be definitive and talking about you have to bring forth a son. But nevertheless, even if you bring forth a daughter, it will continue the posterity of the father because that's still his seed, his children as well. But nevertheless, a son is specified because of carrying on the father's name, which is seen emblematically in the boy or the male child. But nevertheless, the Levirate law does not equal polygamy because you can have a man who will marry his brother's wife and that man doesn't have to be married. Case in point is in Genesis, the 35th chapter, with Judah and his sons. He arranged his youngest son to marry his oldest son's wife after his oldest son was killed because he was wicked before the Lord. But his youngest son didn't have another wife. But that's not our subject today. I just want to explain that the Levirate law doesn't necessarily equal polygamy. In some cases it may cause polygamy, but we're going to show you, even according to the sages, that was one reason why they would not take on or take on the wife of the brother if a man already had a family. This is not anything I'm making up. This stuff was going on in the 1st and 2nd centuries. But nevertheless, the seemingly inevitable result was I'll read it again. Numerous men in the village where we lived thus had a second wife. But the seemingly inevitable result was conflict between the wives. Antagonism, conflicts again. So much so that the second wife normally lived a long distance from the first, usually in a different village. The one man who had both wives in adjacent houses suffered constant conflict between the rivals, leading to frequent quarrels, raging, and destruction of each one's personal effects by the other. While the social benefits of having provision for widows and orphans are clear, it is also clear that polygamy is not an ideal institution or situation. Human nature does not take kindly to it, and it is certain. Polygamy is certain to arouse envy and jealousy. Certainly, it will do it. This is a witness from Kevin May. This is a witness from R. Carey, or Carey R. I don't know the last name. And this is also a witness from Lola Shoinian. And she says that not only is she a witness, but everyone in the villages in Nigeria bear witness of the bitterness and antagonism that arise out of polygamy. People say, well, Brother Judah, that is secular knowledge. Is it? Let's go to back now, because I had you turn to Deuteronomy 21st chapter. Starting at verse 15. Notice this very carefully. The book of the law, Deuteronomy chapter 15. If a man have two wives, one beloved and another hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be, when he maketh his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved firstborn before the son of the hated, which is indeed the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the hated for the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he hath. For he is the beginning of his strength, the right of the firstborn is his. Now, looking past the distribution of the inheritance, let us analyze something else. Let us be analytical of something else. You notice what we was reading? One wife loved and another wife hated. Another wife who isn't preferred before another wife. You see how the Bible is teaching us exactly what we've been reading out of secular knowledge about the human propensity to have favor? Do we see here that one wife is preferred before the other? So therefore this will undermine Genesis. This will even undermine Proverbs. So much for being ravished with the love of the wife of your youth, being ravished with her love always, so much for that being fulfilled with the wife who's hated, right? You see how it undermines what Proverbs was explaining? Being ravished with the wife of your youth. Do you also see how this undermines a woman being given to her desire for her husband? How now this is interrupted because she have a desire towards a man who don't prefer her? Looking past the distribution, we find that beyond the distribution of the goods, we find the undermining of a wife being desirous towards her husband, and a husband cleaving unto his wife, because there's one who he's deciding to cleave to, and there's one who he loves, and there's another one who he isn't cleaving to. Therefore, it is translated that she is the hated. And to regulate or to try to make compensation for her being defrauded, he must give a double portion to the firstborn, which came from the woman who's hated, if she indeed had the firstborn, because of what men would do in showing favor. Now, this, as we see, undermines Genesis. Once you read past the distribution, it undermines Genesis. Now, take, meaning Genesis of Adam and Noah. Specifically of Adam. Cleaving and desiring, husband and wife. One man, one woman. Now, we see this lays the foundations of inequality. We see this lays the foundation of inequality and dissension. So now it's going to be rivals between those two women. Can you understand now the bitterness that will arise from the wife who's hated? Could you understand the bitter rivalry that we've been reading about, that people have witnessed in polygamous countries? That's why the Apostle Paul did not want to allow it in the church, because the church is a microcosm of the kingdom of God that shall fill the earth, and it can't have rivalry like that. It cannot have dissension between women and women. It can't have dissensions like that. So, something else we find, when we bring back in the distribution, in order for a man to make distribution, he have to have a means. So the Torah is also teaching us that this regulation for polygamy is regulated to those with possessions. As the woman said, how hard it might be, for example, to show equity. Also, it is also showing out of the Torah that you got to be a man of means. Not that the woman with the child got to provide for you, you got to provide for them. And history and documentations also prove this, that polygamy was an institution for the ruling class. Show me one person in the Bible who was poor, who had multiple wives. One person in the Bible that we know of in the Bible that was poor, who had multiple wives. So, once we find that out, who can we find in the Bible who's poor, who had multiple wives? That would be very interesting. Because we find in the book of the law that amongst its regulations, when we look beyond just face value, we find a few things here. We find the rising of antagonism. We find the fertile ground being laid for bitter envy between the women. And we also find that it's also an institution of men with wealth. Men with means. Interesting. Now let's go, if you will, to the Jewish Encyclopedia. The Jewish Encyclopedia. And what we find in Jewish Encyclopedia, Volume 10, page 120. Volume 10, page 120. First of all, it gives us the backdrop on what we were explaining. It says that in the ideal state of human society, in the mind of the primitive Israelite, was a monogamous one. Is clearly evidenced by the fact that the first man, Adam, was given only one wife, and that the first instance of bigamy occurred, which is having more than one wife, and more than, which is having two wives, bigamy. Then having more than two is polygamy, or polygyny. Instance of bigamy occurred in the family of the cursed Cain. Noah and his sons also are recorded as having only one wife. So it continues. There is no biblical evidence that any of the prophets lived in polygyny. Monogamous marriage was used by them as a symbol of the union of God with Israel, while polygamy was compared to polytheism or idolatrous worship. So these are for those who go into the scriptures in the book of Jeremiah and of the 3rd chapter. I believe it's Jeremiah the 3rd chapter and Ezekiel the 23rd chapter. No, I believe either Jeremiah chapter 3 or chapter 8. But they go in there and they find the Almighty talk about when Israel committed apostasy, he said that they were two sisters, which were his. Well, if you understand the spirit of the emblem behind it, the Torah pretty much teaches that you really shouldn't take two sisters anyway, as far as what we understand. I know there's conflict with that text, but you shouldn't take a sister beside the other one in their lifetime. This could cause to vex the other. This could cause conflict, according to the Torah. Now, but what we do find is that this emblem This emblematic language or this figurative language of the Almighty having two wives is very interesting if you look at the depth of it. He only had two wives, or the imagery of two wives, when Israel committed apostasy, just like the Jewish Encyclopedia is explaining. It represented polytheism, or multiple gods. And then this was revealed or expressed through polygamy. But when Israel was sound and worshiped only the Creator, then Israel was represented as one wife. And it is manifested again as the Christ, who is the manifestation of the invisible God. He is the embodiment of the invisible God, the personification of the invisible God. John used him as the remarriage of Israel and Elohim. But yet that bride is no longer brides, but it is one wife. And people say, well, you know, in Matthew the 25th chapter, verse 1, it shows that the Christ was showing himself to be going into a polygamous relationship, having 10 virgins. No, it says 10 virgins. It doesn't say 10 brides. And if you want to say it means 10 brides, then we go right to Psalms 45, starting at verse 6, and show you that there were virgins or bridesmaids who followed the bride into the palace of the king in Psalms 45. So therefore, the bridegroom who came to get the virgins, it was the same description in Psalm 45 when the king came to the bride and he called the virgins to his palace, to this wedding feast. So Matthew 25 isn't showing polygamy. It's just said virgins. Now if you want to take it a step further, we got scriptures to show you Psalm 45 to bring it on the side of, no, those are bridesmaids. Now if you don't want to take it there, then it wasn't brides either. It just said virgins. But we know that the Christ got one bride, figuratively speaking, because John described this and Paul also describes this. But when Israel committed apostasy and committed polytheism, then they were described as having two wives. Now I will continue in this dictionary. The Mosaic law, while permitting polygamy, introduced many provisions which tended to confine it to narrower limits and to lessen the abuse that might arise in connection with it. So what we're reading is, according to the sources here in the Jewish Encyclopedia, yes, these are regulations to lessen the abuses that will arise out of polygamy, that will arise out of the bitterness, confrontation with women. So therefore, to make sure that because you stop liking this woman, because maybe she's a little older now, and you don't find yourself a young woman that you want to marry, here you are 45 years old, 50 years old, and here you go, you want to go marry an 18-year-old. This 18-year-old girl that you want to marry now, and your wife about your age, she's about 40 or 50, okay, which was supposed to have been a wife of your youth. Now you done found a young woman, and Miss Lola Shonian, she also talks about that too in her article or in her interview, how all of the older men look, they chase the younger women, causing problems with the older women. Okay, so now all of this bitter, this envy. So now that older woman had your first child, but yet, boy, you cleaving to this younger woman. And this envy arising, this contention is arising, and now there is a growing wedge of dissension between you and your first wife because of her hostility towards your new wife, and now you got the tendency to want to give your inheritance to the wife who you love. Because of these abuses that arise out of polygamy, we have regulation in the Torah. But he wanted polygamy to exist in the society of Israel no more than he wanted a king to exist in the society of Israel. Because in the foundations of Genesis, in the society of Adam, there was no polygamy out of the godly seed of Adam until Cain. children. And they were children of the flesh. And there was no hierarchy of a king inside the early society of Adam until Cain's children, who created a hierarchy and began to develop borders and deprive men of their right of inheritance to the earth. So both tyranny of a king and polygamy rose out of the lineage of Cain. It did not exist in the early society of Adam. The monarch or the kings and polygamy rose out of the seed of the imperialist Cain. That should teach you some lessons when you understand in the Bible on a political and a social scale. We're finding that the foundations that corrupted the old world was Cain. He changed the old world. And because he changed the old world, his children introduced polygamy. His children introduced the division and dividing up of land and depriving other men of land and resources. Read the book of Josephus, Antiquity of the Jews, and you will find a record of Cain as well. So we understand abuses could arise, right? Abuses could arise out of this situation. Why? Because a woman's desire should be towards her husband. Now look at this, people. Let's go now, if you will, to Genesis chapter 11, because people will bring into example about Abraham. Well, Abraham had multiple wives. He was a friend of God. Abraham was the friend of God. And Abraham also made mistakes. David was beloved of God. David also made mistakes. But looking into the depth of the situation here, let's analyze this very carefully about Abraham. Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. Notice this in Genesis chapter 11. And let's look at something carefully, because we must study to show ourselves approved, and most of all, we must pray to the Almighty to give us the Spirit to understand what He's explaining and teaching us. So if you notice in Genesis chapter 11, starting at verse 26, it reads, "And Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran begot Lot." Okay, so that is verse 27. Verse 28 reads, "And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah." Abraham took a wife named Sarai. Correct? Is that what we find? Now notice this, verse 30. "Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. And Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son's Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran." So Abraham and his wife have no children. Now, the society in which we're reading now with Abraham is different than the society in which Adam established him and Eve in the beginning. That early society was egalitarian, a socialist or communist egalitarianism. It was interrupted by Cain. The great flood came. Nimrod began this on this side of the flood, tyranny and oppression and inequality, just as Cain started inequality and oppression before the flood. Post-flood, Nimrod began the tyranny of inequality and oppression, and this is the environment of Abraham. Okay? Now, the institutions of polygamy existed among the ruling classes. The institutions of polygamy existed among the ruling classes. I'll show you in support of this out of the Jewish Encyclopedia, page 121. It reads, even in the Orient, monogamy soon became the rule and polygamy the exception. For only the wealthy could afford the luxury of many wives. Only the wealthy can afford the luxury of many wives. Okay? Now, this is important to know and to understand. It is an institution of the wealthy. Now, Genesis chapter 12, starting at verse 1. Now the Lord said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him. And Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. Abraham, 75 years old, in a monogamous relationship. 75 years old. Note that. In a monogamous relationship. So as far as Abraham being this big polygamist, not so. He is in a monogamous relationship, and now he's been promised that he should be a father of many nations. And the earth shall be blessed in him. Right? Nevertheless, he still only had one wife. Now let's see if Abraham came up with the bright idea that I need to have more wives in order for this to happen. Which we know that wasn't necessary, because Adam populated the earth, Noah populated the earth, and they didn't need to have more than one wife. So look, now we turn our Bibles to Genesis chapter 15, starting at verse 1. After these things the word of the Lord came unto Abraham in a vision, saying, fear not, Abram. I am thy shield and thy exceedingly great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? And Abram said, behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, this shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth of thy own bowels shall be thine heir. And he brought him forth abroad, and said, look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. Look at the stars, Abram. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. So, this promise is given to Abraham. Abraham believed. But Abraham did not seek another wife. To the contrary, look what happened. Go to Genesis chapter 16. So Sarah found that she was going to have a son. And she laughed at it, showing that God would bring forth this promised seed through Sarah. But it's something else here. Before Sarah was told the news that she will have a son, this is the mind state she was in previously. When Abraham was told he shall be the father of many nations, we go right into Genesis 16, starting at verse 1. It reads, "And Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children." She bare him no children. And she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. Now, even the reason why they got Hagar was very interesting because of the institutions of polygamy and the rich men taking men wives. Abraham found himself in fear that his wife would be taken by the elite. Isaac feared the same thing. Polygamy actually laid the institutions of violence against men losing their wives. So that's how they got Hagar, when God stood up and protected Sarai and didn't allow the Egyptian monarch to take Abraham's wife, because Abraham had one wife. It wasn't until 85 years old that Abraham was coerced into having another wife. It wasn't anything he chose himself, which is in contrast to what we see today, where it is now the men making a petition to have another wife. This is to be distinct. This is a distinction with the polygamists whom they brag on, Abraham and Jacob. These men didn't ask for other wives. This is an important distinction between the spirit of polygamy that existed with Abraham and Jacob, in contrast to the spirit of polygamy that exists today among men. Abraham's wife suggested it. Jacob's wives suggested it. That is very important to take into consideration when we're looking at the spirit of the institution of polygamy among the patriarchs. That it wasn't nothing that they desired. Now, she didn't have no children, so Sarai decides to give Abraham Hagar. Now, notice this again. Verse 2, "And Sarai said unto Abraham, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my handmaid," or unto my maid. "It may be that I may obtain children by her." A different society. Now, if we look past now just the agreement being made between Abraham and his wife to take this woman, you know what the Bible doesn't teach us? How old was this woman? Was this woman in her 20s? Was she in her teens? Abraham was 85 years old. Was this woman in her 30s? It doesn't tell you. But we have to bring this into question because of other documentation on polygamy, that this must be called into question because this became serious problems. Hagar very well may have been an older woman. You understand? And now she wants Abraham to have a child by a younger woman, which is probably likely that she was in childbearing ages from the ages of 18 to 20. She could have been very young. Now, not only that, because of the environment, we also see an inequality there. Not necessarily that Abraham and Sarah made it up, because God got to straighten it all out. But we do see the idea of this woman not even having a choice. Hagar not having a choice. She is not on the same level. Inequality. Hagar herself is an example of inequality. So when we're looking at this monogamous versus polygamous institutions, you have to look past than just what you're reading. Look into depth. Look at the social construct. Hagar, handmaid, no choice, inequality. Then we have also this taking place. Verse 3. And Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her handmaid, the Egyptian, after Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. What happened? What did the dictionary say? It is significant, interpretation of the Bible, it is significant that the common Semitic name for second wife is Tasara, which root meaning is showing hostility towards or to vex. Look at this. Verse 4. And he went unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Why? Well, in real time, what happens? This woman pregnant, young woman pregnant with Abraham's child. Abraham might show now more compassion and tender mercies toward her. He might be showing more affection towards her. He might be making sure that the servants and everything take care of her because of her condition bringing forth a child. Believe that she will warrant Abraham's attention. And believe she's likely to be a younger woman. That's why that's why Sarah came up with the idea. Now we got to look at this as real time, real life. So what did this gender in the woman? Well, she began to look at Sarai in the wrong manner. We have said Sarai and Hagar have proved this was a mistake. This was a mistake. Now notice, Sarai being an older woman, Hagar being a younger woman. All right, now notice this. Sarai being the older wife, right? And Hagar being the younger. Hagar now is despising Sarai. Verse 6. Or verse, verse 5. And Sarai said unto Abraham, my wrong be upon thee. Now we have explained this in times past, like Hagar's or Sarai admitting she was wrong. Nevertheless, what we will lean more towards is Hagar or Sarai is explaining that the wrong that was done to her by Hagar is Abraham's fault. Now some argue that Sarai didn't take any responsibility of her own and she is just being selfish and blaming Abraham. But that might not totally be the case. It could be some validity to it. Abraham actually could have said no and not hearken, number one. Number two is because of the social condition created by this pregnant woman and needing more nurturing and needing assistance and needing also attention, this attention very well possibly given by Abraham as well among his servants could have caused this animosity to be created between Hagar and her mistress. Nevertheless, either way it go, we see antagonisms arising. Such antagonisms that it reads, Sarai saying, Abraham, my wrong be upon thee. This wrong that I'm suffering be upon you. I have given my maid unto thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and you. So in order for her to say the Lord judge between me and you, it wasn't, I would not argue that Sarah was just totally selfish. However, what we do see is now something happening in the relationship where she's faulting Abraham for Hagar to respond this way. And this is one thing that we know is confirming. This example in Genesis is teaching us the antagonisms that arise out of polygamy. More specifically, in this case, bigamy, which is a form of polygamy, but it's showing you how it arises right here with the patriarch. So when we look at multiple wives and people try to argue multiple wives, that's all they look at is Abraham had another wife. They don't look at the deterioration between two women. Or the deterioration between a young woman who's already in a position of inequality as a servant, but being shown justice and equity in Abraham's society until, you understand, in Abraham's village and compound, people were treated just. Until this happened, Hagar's whole life probably changed. So now the woman figure, Sarai, which was probably like a mother figure to her, is no longer a mother figure to her. They become stark enemies. Why? Not because it was inherent in them to be enemies, but because of this institution of polygamy that entered the realm of Abraham. It caused an immediate dissension, just as the dictionary described, and also as we read from the interview with Lola Shonian, she actually said that, quote, everyone knows a woman who's been a wife in a polygamous household, especially in Africa. And they know how bitter they are. You see how this bitterness arose in Sarah? Now bitterness shall also arise in Hagar. They, quote, again, according to Ms. Lola Shonian out of Nigeria, they've all seen this transformation. You have a beautiful lovely young woman. They become a wife in a polygamous household and they change completely. You see, they change. Not because they want to, but because in that small family setup they have to become monsters to survive, or else you'll be eaten down or you could be killed as well. Now, we're not saying that Sarai would do that to Hagar. We don't know what it could have led into, but we do know that the Creator had to split them up. They had to split up. Sarai said they got to go. Why? Because of the antagonisms. But people who read the Torah or read the first covenant outside of the spirit, they don't regard the repercussions that Hagar faced, now being a single parent. They don't regard the repercussions that Sarai faced. They don't regard the repercussions and deterioration between a relationship between the mother and the spirit, which was Sarai, to the young woman who was like a daughter in the spirit, which was Hagar. Men don't consider that when they're reading about polygamy, when they're reading the Torah according to the flesh. So you got to read it according to the spirit. We see exactly what the Bible is saying. Antagonisms arose. Okay? Antagonisms arose. And when these antagonisms arose, and Abraham was accused, but Abraham said unto Sarai, behold, thy maidservant is in thy hand to do to her as it pleased, as it pleased thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. So now, because of this polygamous interruption inside of Abraham's life, which only happened once, there's no record that he ever laid with her again. Because of this polygamous relationship, brief polygamous relationship, or bigamous to be more specific, what did it create in Abraham's world? Inequality and injustice. Why? Because Sarai now took the stance to deal hardly with a woman in a vulnerable position. And so now who suffers? The woman who isn't the senior wife, but the woman who is the secondary wife and her child. So now what repercussions do Ishmael suffer? Because now he's being raised under a single parent. These things you have to take into consideration. This is the depth of biblical knowledge. I'm going to read something to you. This is out of an article from the Witherspoon Institute, Public Discourse. The Perils of Polygamy. by Christopher Kaczor. The Perils of Polygamy Within Marriage. Notice this. The phenomenon of co-wives also undermines the well-being of women. You see we read here? The phenomenon of co-wives. We have two wives, Hagar and Sarai. But we're learning that it says the phenomenon of co-wives, a misnomer since polygamy typically involves a hierarchy among wives. So in other words, they're not really co-wives. There was a hierarchy, just as it was here. It was a hierarchy. Sarah being the senior wife. What does this do to the other wife? It undermines the well-being of women. So if Sarai now have given Hagar to be Abraham's wife, Abraham was supposed to cleave to Hagar, right? And Hagar's desire was to be towards Abraham, according to the principles of Genesis. But those principles are now undermined. So we find the phenomenon of co-wives, a misnomer since polygamy typically involves a hierarchy among wives, also undermines the well-being of women. So now it puts Sarah in a position to be a harsh disciplinarian and to treat this woman hardly when she probably didn't deserve it. And it also causes Hagar to now look at Sarah in a certain way in which Hagar shouldn't have looked at her mistress as despised. So it undermines the well-being of the women. So now this relationship between Hagar and Sarai is now rent. There is now antagonisms. But that isn't what God wants. He wants them to dwell together in love. But because of this relationship, it deteriorated their unity and fraternal sisterhood. It undermined their very well-being, creating this schism. The senior wives worry that they will be replaced by younger wives. And the younger wives in turn worry about the power exerted in the home by senior wives. That's why Hagar fled, because of the power in which Sarai possessed. This is why Sarai responded the way she did, because she felt she was being replaced by the younger wife. Exactly what this study is showing, biblically being supported. Research indicates that levels of domestic strife and violence are higher in polygamous homes than in monogamous homes, as wives seek to preserve their place with their shared husband, as well as struggle to secure resources for their own biological children, as Henrik and his colleagues pointed out. Quote, Henrik and his colleagues, quote, co-wives conflict is ubiquitous in polygynous households. It's all over the place, man. Conflict is all over the place. Studies have shown it. We have witnesses that we read in the earlier of this study that's showing it. Conflict. In the Genesis, it wasn't conflict. So when Paul is explaining that every man have his own wife and every woman have her own husband, he's eliminating conflict to reestablish Genesis with Adam. Co-wife conflict is ubiquitous in polygynous households. From Anthropology, a review of ethnographic data from 69 Sorrel polygynous societies from around the globe reveals no case where co-wife relations could be described as harmonious. From 69 non-Sorrel polygynous societies, there was no case that they found where co-wife relations could be described as harmonious. You see why Paul had to undermine polygamy? You understand when we're looking at what polygamy does to society, it makes sense why the foundations of society were Adam, to share the world, to be co-heirs of equity without or having the absence of inequality, having the absence of conflict. It was founded upon a monogamous society. Conflict arose with Sarah and Hagar. Conflict. So now there is a schism between the two. If we take our passage in the Bible and flip right over to Genesis 29. Another example. I'm going to give you 3 examples. And we discussed this further in our other teaching on polygamy and inequality. But look, Genesis. So Abraham wind up sending Hagar away. After Sarai had passed on, there is no record that Abraham had any relation with Hagar again. After Sarai passed on, Abraham married again and entered into a monogamous relationship with Keturah. However, he had more sons with Keturah than he did in the bigamous experience with Hagar. Showing that out of monogamy, the promise of Abraham having multiple children was definitely realized in a monogamous relationship. In the marriage with Keturah, Abraham being a father of many children was definitely realized in a marriage with Keturah because he had multiple children with Keturah. But that was a monogamous relationship. Now, if we go back into Genesis, the 29th chapter, something else happens with Jacob. Something else happens with Jacob. And in Genesis 29, starting at verse 1, after Jacob had a schism with his brother, he had to flee the land. Okay? And when he fled the land, Genesis 29:1, he went to his kindred from his mother's side of the family. Then Jacob went, or his relatives, on his mother's side of the family. Then Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the people of the east. And he looked, and behold, came to the people of the east. I'm going to skip down for time. Verse 5. And he said unto them, Know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And he said unto them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel, his daughter, cometh with the sheep. So now we're reading about Jacob as he is meeting Rachel, all right, whom he fell in love with. She's coming with the sheep, and he's going to introduce himself. We're going to skip down to verse 12. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother, and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. Notice this. After he told her father, it says, And it came to pass when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him, and embraced him, and kissed him, and brought him into his house, and he told Laban all these things. And Laban said unto him, Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. He abode with him in the space of a month, or with him the space of a month. And Laban said unto Jacob, Because thou art my brother, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel thy younger daughter. And Laban said, it is better that I give her to thee, than I should give her to another man. Abide with me. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had toward her. All right, so we understand that. Now, what happened is that after the wedding ceremony, in verse 23, and it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, or I'll continue, verse 21. And Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place, and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter, and brought her unto Jacob, or him. And he went in unto her. So Jacob went in unto Leah. Laban tricked him. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah his maid for an handmaid. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said unto Laban, what is this that thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? So now we see that this polygamous relationship that everybody brag about with Jacob, it wasn't as clear cut as they make it seem. Jacob didn't pursue polygamy. He wanted one woman. He was deceived into getting another woman, which was Leah, because of the deception and business practices of Laban, his uncle. So we see the corruption of Laban caused this polygamous relationship. His corruption. And Laban have put his daughters in a position which was terrible. This is the behind the scenes of the polygamy that everyone brag on with Jacob. Get to the spirit of the matter. So now he's been beguiled. And Laban said in verse 26, it must not be so done in our country to give the younger for the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and we'll give thee, fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. And Jacob did so, and fulfilled her week, and he gave him Rachel his daughter to wife. Now notice this very carefully. Here we are getting to the meat of our discussion. Laban gave Rachel his daughter Bilhah his handmaid to be her maid. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved Rachel also more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. So now, immediately the Bible's teaching us the seeds of antagonism have generated again. Conflict has generated again. Notice, out of the dictionary of the out of the interpreted dictionary of the Bible, recall what we have read. Polygamous marriage, this is volume 10. In a polygamous marriage, and perhaps in a special way, there are only two, where in polygamous marriage, and perhaps in a special way, when there are only 2 wives, the appearance of conflict and dissension is apparent. One wife might be the husband's favorite, and bitter rivalry could ensue. One may be the favorite, and bitter rivalry could ensue. Let's see if we can follow this up a little bit. Now I want to read something else to you out of another historical, or should I say, a study. Philosophical topics. The problem with polygyny. And this is page 111. And from the study, they're arguing, section 2. One argument, quote, I'm quoting, one argument against polygamy is that it is more likely to present harmful effects, especially towards women and children, than monogamy. Going back into the harmful effects that it can cause among the relationships. bitterness that we have read with Lola Shoynian interview, that it's not even in the woman's nature, but she is changed in a polygamous relationship to become bitter because of the condition she has been driven in. Lola says in Nigeria that women can tell other women in polygamous relationships because of the bitterness. Bitterness has no room for the spirit of the Torah. So when we're reading the bitterness that's ensuing between these women, the spirit of the Torah teaches you the damaging effects it has towards society, and most importantly, the kingdom of God, which is the foundation of the society. So the one argument against polygamy is that it is more likely to present harmful effects, especially towards women and children, than monogamy. There are several studies that appear to support this position. For example, women in polygamous marriages are at a higher risk of low self-esteem as well as depression than women in non-polygamous relationships. Low self-esteem and depression that they have found in studies in polygamous societies. Is this what we found here? Notice this, that what we find with Rachel and Leah, that verse 31 in chapter 29 of the book of Genesis, and when, verse 30, and when he went in also unto Rachel, he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. He's loving one before the other. This is causing an inequality and will bring forth a bitter rival, even though Jacob didn't want it, is he was deceived into it. However, the Bible is teaching us the repercussions that arose from this polygamy. So this is not just between two sisters that vex each other. This happened between an older woman and a younger woman with Abraham. I hope you can understand the depth of what we're dealing with when we talk about polygamy. Verse 31. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. What do you mean? Well, now if Leah is hated, how can Jacob now keep the law of cleaving unto his wife? How can Jacob be obedient unto the wisdom of the ages where a man should be ravished with the wife of his youth or his wife? We're finding that his love could not be distributed in equity. That's why Lola said how hard it is to have equity, because it's difficult for a man now, as the Bible's proven us, to not show favor. Both examples in the Torah teaches us of them not showing favor. Now look, Rachel's womb was open. Now there's an antagonism. Now Leah conceived and bare a son and called his name Reuben. For she said, surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. We're finding that this is undermined. Jacob being deceived into polygamy by his uncle putting his daughters into a compromising position, and their handmaids also being driven into a compromising position. We're finding that the fruits of it is contention, antagonism, and strife. And Leah is confirming she is in affliction in this marriage situation. In this polygamous relationship, Leah is confirming under this institution of polygamy, she is afflicted, which also brings forth bitterness. That's why they begin to argue over the mandrakes. That's why they argue over, well, you done took my son. Now you done took my husband. Now you want to take my my son's mandrakes, all of the bitter rivalry that took place. Look, we will continue. Leah said she was afflicted. Verse 33, she also says, and she conceived again and bare a son. And Leah said, because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he hath therefore given me this son also, and she called his name Simon. So Simon and Reuben are testimonies of the inequality and injustices that Leah faced. First, she was afflicted. 2, she testified she was hated, none of which would have existed. It was less likely to exist if she was in a monogamous relationship. The more polygamy, as you add on wives, it increases the likelihood of this taking place. Yes, it could happen in a monogamous relationship, but the likelihood of it taking place increases with adding wives. Afflicted, hated, and notice this. Because she found she was hated, she had named him Simeon. Verse 34, she conceived again and bare a son, and said, now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons, therefore his name was called Levi, signifying that Jacob was not joined unto her, teaching us that Jacob did not follow through with Genesis chapter 2 in relation to Leah, in Genesis chapter 2, where it says that in verse 24, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. We find this was not being fulfilled in this polygamous or polygamous relationship with Jacob. Leah being afflicted, unloved, and now is proving Jacob did not cleave unto her. But her desire is towards Jacob, but is not being complemented by Jacob cleaving unto her. See what polygamy have brought? The spirit of polygamy, when we read in Moses, this is the Torah we're reading. So when we're reading Moses, we're learning, according to the Spirit, the devastating effects that it has, truly, just like we read. In The Problem with Polygamy, Philosophical Topics, Volume 37. The argument against polygamy is that it is more likely to present harmful effects, especially towards women and children, than monogamy. There are several studies that appear to support this position. For example, women in polygamous marriages are at a higher risk of low self-esteem, as well as depression, than women in non-polygamous relationships. We find Rachel is in a bout of depression. We find Sarai was in a bout of depression. That's why she dealt hardly with Hagar. We find Hagar was in a bout of depression, being cast away, where she even thought she was going to lose her son. But the angel redeemed her, because the Spirit understands the position that these women have been found. The reason why men don't really, or the male factor, don't quite understand what we're reading in Genesis is because of the influence of the Western theology and the male chauvinist doministic mentality. You don't even care what happened to the women, because we've been taught not to care. But when we understand the Torah according to the Spirit, you're going to care what happened to the women just like you're going to care what happened to your own mama or your own sisters. Conflict. In chapter 30 of the book of Genesis, it says, when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children lest I die. Bitter rivalry. Genesis 30:1. Bitter rivalry. What happened? Now that this is going on in this polygamous relationship, Rachel now envied Leah. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, am I in God's stead? Who hath withheld thee from the fruit of the womb? So now it's causing antagonism between Jacob and Rachel. There was already an antagonism between Leah and Jacob. So what happened? He was forced into a further polygamy. So Rachel said, take my handmaid Bilhah. And then we find that Leah, when she could not conceive, Leah saw that she left off barren, and then she took Zilpah and gave him to Jacob. Jacob find himself in a spiral of conflicts because of polygamy and this bitter rivalry between two sisters. Between two sisters. Who's stuck in the middle? The sons, the children. The sons and the children. Do you know how this might have affected Dinah? Because she knew her mother wasn't loved? Did this have any effects on Dinah being defiled by going off into the land and being defiled by the inhabitants of Canaan? Does this effect show what happened with Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, and his handmaid, which was a much younger woman? The truth of the matter is, the handmaid that Reuben slept with was probably more his age than Jacob was with the handmaid, causing problems, sexual immorality, and problems within the society. Notice this carefully. Jacob had dissension, Leah had dissension, and we also find it in the book of 1 Samuel. The book of 1 Samuel. If we go to the book of 1 Samuel, we will find a problem again with Samuel, the judge. And it's interesting because we compare the law of polygamy with the law of the monarchy. The Creator allowed the kings, but he didn't prefer the kings. The Creator allowed and had regulations for polygamy, but when we read the examples of polygamy, it undermines exactly what the Creator was trying to establish: a society of love and justice. And notice this here, among Samuel, the first chapter. Samuel, 1 Samuel, the first chapter, what does it read? Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zoph, an Ephrathite. Now notice this. Elkanah in subject here. And when we're looking at Elkanah, what happens? Verse 2, and he had two wives. The name of the one was Hannah. The name of the other was Peninnah, or Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. Okay? And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters portions. A man of means, supporting what we was reading in the Torah. A man of means. Polygamy is an institution among people of means. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, or a double portion. For he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. He probably loved Hannah more than Peninnah. You understand? When we start to look at the backdrop of when you find one woman who wasn't having children, the other one loved, and the other one hated. But nevertheless, it doesn't specify. But what it do specify is that he loved Hannah, but her womb was shut. Now notice this. And her adversary, or her Satan. Notice what's being said. Hannah's Satan also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord has shut her womb. Peninnah, her co-wife, did exactly what the studies have shown. It reads, quote, in this study of the problem with polygamy, for example, women in polygamous marriages are at higher risk of low self-esteem as well as depression than women in non-polygamous relationships. This is proven from Abraham, this is proven from Jacob, and now this is proven from Elkanah and Hannah. Hannah is now in depression. She's fretting, low self-esteem, if you will, because she don't feel like she can have no babies. Just like Rachel envied her sister. Hannah now is in conflict and animosity with another co-wife, Peninnah. Conflicts, conflicts, conflicts. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. And this is what Hannah did. Hannah went and she prayed like verse 13. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. And Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, no, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. She's what? She's a woman of low self-esteem. She's a woman of depression. She's a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord, or before Yahweh. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken here too. Her grief, her complaint, her sorrowful spirit is a testimony that reveals to us, according to secular studies, that arisen out of polygamy. It had arisen out of polygamy. So now we are confirming what the studies have been showing us. Conflicts, turmoil, bitterness, Penuel, in order for her to be a Satan towards Hannah, reveals bitterness. See, so when we read this article, the interview with Lola Shoynian, which was a Nigerian author who lived in Nigeria in a culture that had polygamy, she explained the same thing. Everyone knows a woman who's been a wife in a polygamous household, especially in Africa, and they know how bitter they are. They've all seen this transformation. You have a beautiful, lovely young woman, they become a wife of a polygamous household, and they change completely to bitterness and sorrow. Rachel, bitterness, sorrow. Leah, bitterness, sorrow. Sarah, bitterness and sorrow, where she had to send away her handmaid. The relationship between Hagar and Sarah was destroyed. When you understand what the kingdom of God has established, you learn that you cannot have this in the kingdom. And Paul undermined this when he said, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2, let every woman have her own husband, or let each woman have her own husband, and each man his own wife. Don't run around sleeping with nobody else's wife, and don't run around sleeping with nobody else's husband. Keep the envy and strife down. Eliminate it. So, brothers and sisters, as we move forward, this began to be such of a problem in the world that when we go to the book, for example, of Ruth, and we see Boaz, because some mention the Levirate law. And I may mention earlier, in the Levirate law, it doesn't equal polygamy. The Levirate law is when a husband or a man, takes the wife of his deceased kinsman to bring forth a son. Now, in the book of Ruth, we find the Levirate law being exercised between Boaz and his kinsman with Ruth. But I'm going to read an excerpt to you out of the Jewish Encyclopedia that you need to take into consideration that the elders or the sages had commented on in the Targum. Whether you say they're Israelites or converts, notice this. The general sentiment against polygamy is illustrated in a story related of the son of YHWH'S. And from my understanding, YHWH'S, from my understanding, I was told that he is the one who laid the foundation for the Talmud. But nevertheless, we are making reference to the Targum. A particular passage in the Targum, Aramaic paraphrases, to Ruth chapter 4, verse 6, points to the same state of popular feeling. What state of popular feeling? And sentiment against polygamy. So this commentary in the Targum, probably 2nd or 3rd century AD, showed a sentiment among Torah believers, Israelites and converts, against polygamy. Ruth chapter 4, 6 points to the same state of popular feeling. The kinsman of Elimelech being requested by Boaz to marry Ruth said, quote, I cannot redeem. In other words, I can't go through the Levirate law. For I have a wife, and have no right to take another in addition to her. Lest she be a disturbance in my house and destroy my peace. Redeem thou, for thou hast no wife. So when we're looking at this in the Targum, the commentary says the reason why the next of kin before Boaz, Elimelech, next of kin, refused to deal with the Levirate law, because the Levirate law wasn't a commandment, it was something, it was an option. You can choose it or you can not do it. And one of the reasons we're learning out of the Targum that they're arguing that the next of kin did not do it because he was already married and he didn't want conflict. So he told Boaz, or asked Boaz, to fulfill that obligation. Our Amy was of the opinion that a woman had a right to claim, I'm going to get to that one later, I'm sorry. I went to a separate part. This is corroborated by our Isaac, who says that the wife of Boaz died on the day when Ruth entered Palestine. So this was according to the tradition that Boaz didn't have a wife. And the next of kin didn't marry Ruth because he didn't want to cause conflict inside of his inheritance. There's something else to take into consideration. During this time,
polygamy was rampant among Muslims. Or should I say, after this time, going back into the probably 7th, 8th centuries, up until now. Polygamy was rampant among Muslims. And I'm going to tell you, this is what Israelites begin to do, because you find women being sideswiped by the men now invoking polygamy. Nevertheless, they're disannulling their original vow that they made with their woman. If those of you who are married by law and went through marital ceremonies, we have performed marriages ourselves. I have performed marriages. And one thing that is written in the law is that you would take the wife and only that wife within her lifetime. That's why when a man sleeps with another woman, whether she's married or not, it's argued it's adultery, because it's a breach in the contract. That's what adultery is. It's a breach in contract. Now, if your contract is saying that you're only going to have this one woman in your lifetime, until death do you part, then when you find another woman, it's a breach of contract, which is profane or adultery. Okay? That is the difference. So in marital contracts in the days of Moses, they probably didn't have that clause in there. So therefore, if you married another woman who was unmarried, it wouldn't have been adultery because it wasn't in the contract. But nevertheless, it's not necessarily what the Almighty wanted. But when it began to disrupt the society, look what these Israelites did. This is, again, the Jewish Encyclopedia, Volume 10, page 121. In Africa, where Mohammedan influence was strongest, the custom was to include in the marriage contract the following paragraph. Quote, I'm quoting the paragraph which they would include in the marital contract. The said bridegroom hereby promises that he will not take a second wife during the lifetime of the said bride, except with her consent. And if he transgresses this oath and takes a second wife during the lifetime of the said bride, and without her consent, he shall give her every tittle of what is written in the marriage settlement. It continues. Together with all the voluntary additions herein detailed, paying all to her up to the last farthing, and he shall free her by regular divorce instantly and with fitting solemnity. This condition was rigidly enforced by the rabbinic authorities. The contract had to be put there because of the influences and the problems in polygamous societies. We see so far the examples we had given. Now we deal with it in our other teachings about David. David had more wives. David had extra wives. And thus and such, and thus and such. This is what they bring to the table, correct? First of all, the man had to have a wife of means. I mean, the man had to have means to provide. This is found again, I'm going to show you in the book of the law. This is revealed in Exodus 21st chapter. And again, it's still showing you how the woman is defrauded in Exodus 21 in the example of polygyny. Exodus chapter 21, and if we look at verse 9, it reads, and if this is, again, when you're looking at Exodus 21, this is a different society than Genesis. With Adam and society of equity. When you're looking at Exodus 21 in Moses' society, inequality and corruption had already corrupted the world. That's why Moses gathered together Israel to straighten the world out. However, the Almighty had to put regulations in there because of the hardness of the people's hearts. He didn't want divorce, but it's in there. He didn't want a king, but he allowed it. So he allowed polygamy. But it's nothing that we learn through the examples is conducive in building a kingdom. So we will argue that Most High didn't want that either. He wanted it like he said like in Genesis. He gave Adam one wife, not several. He didn't tell Noah to take a few wives. Okay? Now look. Verse 7 in Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21 and verse 7 reads, "And if a man shall sell his daughter to be a maidservant, she shall not go out as the men servants do." Now this is in certain circumstances. Number one, why does she have to be sold as a maidservant? That is another discussion that the Torah begs us to analyze. When you stop looking at this like religion and understand what God is building, you're forced to analyze, why is she being sold as a maidservant anyway? But nevertheless, there's other teachings. Normally, a woman could leave in the 7th year, according to the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Jeremiah. Under certain circumstances, though, it says a woman could not leave out as the men servants do. Why? If she please not her why? It says, if she please not her master who hath betrothed her to himself. In other words, this woman is given as a maidservant and she's betrothed to the husband. Pretty much like what happened with Zillah and Bilhah, like what happened with Hagar. They were given to the husbands. But the husbands didn't ask in Abraham and Jacob's case. So now, getting all the way down hundreds of years later to Moses, polygamy takes on a different face. So now you have, in this particular case, the man might want to take the woman or the young woman as his wife. But it says, if she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. In other words, she shall be redeemed and let go. And let go. But isn't that a breach of covenant? You understand what I'm saying? Is that what God really wanted him to do? You said you're going to betroth her to be yours. Now all of a sudden, now you're going to let her go? To sell, only right, he will have to let her go if she slept with another person. Like his son. Like Reuben slept with his father's wife. Why does that happen though? It's known to happen in polygamous relationships. Especially when the age gap is so wide. We're going to show you before we close out. And we're almost there. If she please not her master who hath betrothed her to himself, then shall he let her be redeemed. To sell her to a strange nation, he shall have no power. He don't have the authority to do that. Seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. Why? Because you were supposed to marry her, and you have dealt deceitfully with her. My question to all these Torah observant people who want polygamy, what was the punishment of him being what was the punishment of the man deceiving his woman and dealing deceitfully with her? What was his punishment? Malachi told you. God is a swift witness. Do anyone take into consideration the condition of the women? At this school, we must do it. Because liberty and freedom and justice cannot come and fill this earth as long as there are any forms of inequality and injustice. He's dealt deceitfully with her, and it continues in verse 9, and if he have betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. If he take him another wife, this is parted by love. If he take another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. If he do not these three unto her, then shall she go out free without money. You see again the Bible showing this is a man with means. And if the man, notice, if he don't take care of her, what happens? She get to go because she's been dealt with deceitfully. Not that she got to make a living and provide for him like a pimp. No, he got to provide for her. And a lot of these people, if not all of these poor men who's trying to gather an argument on polygamy, they poor. And there is no example of a poor man having multiple wives in the Bible. And the examples of multiple wives in the Bible, in the Torah, both of them in Deuteronomy and in Exodus, teaches us each case they were men of means. And all the examples given were of men of means. Now in our other teaching we deal more with the kings. And we will probably follow up. So this won't be too. I'm already in a lot of time already. So people take your time and look through it. But what I want to show out of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible, what the Essenes said about polygamy. Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible. Page 55. This is the New Translation by Michael Wise, Martin Abegg Jr., and Edward Cook. The Dead Sea Scrolls, a New Translation. Excuse me, I keep saying Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible. That is a different book. This is out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a New Translation. So these are the scrolls of the Qumran sect. Now when we look at this, in the Damascus document, we find something on page 55 in this translation. And it talks about the 3 traps of Belial. The 3 traps of Belial. This section explaining the text just quoted, which was the previous text, what they were quoting Isaiah and Micah. But we want to bring something else out here about Belial. The true meaning of this verse concerns the 3 traps of Belial, about which Levi, son of Jacob, said that Belial would catch Israel in, so he directed them towards the 3 kinds of righteousness. And this you will find in making reference to Micah 7 and 11 and Isaiah 24. When Isaiah 24 talk about the fear in the pit shall entrap the dwellers in the land. So he's saying that the Essenes are arguing, Isaiah 24 talking about the 3 traps that shall compass the Israelites. The 3 traps of Belial. And these 3 traps are 1, fornication. 2, wealth. And the 3rd is defiling the sanctuary. Who escapes from one is caught in the next. And whosoever escaped from that is caught in the other. So they're saying the 3 traps of Belial is wealth, fornication, and the defiling of the sanctuary. Now notice their argument on the fornication. They're going to make reference to the shoddy wall builders in Micah 2:6. But notice this. They are caught in 2 traps. Those who he's making reference to in Micah and Isaiah. They're talking about the traps that are being caught up with the deceit of Belial. They are caught in 2 traps. Fornication. Notice what the Essenes are saying fornication is. Fornication. By taking 2 wives in their lifetimes. Although the principle of creation is male and female, he created them. Genesis 1 and 27. Column 5 reads, and those who went into the ark 2 by 2. Genesis 7:9. Concerning the leader it is written, he shall not multiply wives unto himself. Now let's continue this. So this was in the Damascus scrolls. Fornication, they're saying, is taking more than 1 wife. Why are they arguing that? Because within their community, it was common that they had a monogamous relationship. And just like the contracts we read, if you went outside that monogamous relationship, that was a breach of covenant. So among the Essenes, it was to be 1 wife. But they're arguing it is fornication. Showing that the Essenes was against polygamy. Alright? And they were against the king having more than 1 wife. Now, it's something else to this. as we look at the opposition to polygamy by the Essenes, and their opposition about amassing wealth, and their opposition about polluting the sanctuary. One wife they want. Now look, this is what they declared. Now these are Israelites who spoke Hebrew. These are Israelites. Now notice, they said the leader shall have one wife. Now if we go to column 57, okay, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and here we're looking at, on page 485, duties and functions of the king with regard to the army, commanders, the royal bodyguard, the royal council, the queen, and acting as judge. Now we're going to look at some specific points in column 57. And our point we want to look at is the king, regarding the king in regard to the queen. It reads, the king, he may not take a wife from any of the nations, which corresponds to the Torah. Rather, he must take himself a wife from his father's house or among his kindred, that is, from his father's family. He is not to take another wife in addition to her. You see how the Essenes understood the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 24, where a king shall not multiply wives or add unto himself more riches or too much riches. Okay? It didn't say he should not add too many wives. It said too many riches. But with wives, he just simply said multiply. And to have one wife is multiplying. And the Essenes are proving that the king shall take a wife from his father's house, that is, from his father's family. He is not to take another wife in addition to her. No. She alone shall be with him as long as he lives. If she dies, then he may take himself another wife from his father's house, that is, his family. How shall a king conduct himself? One wife, according to the Essenes. The standard of the king. One wife. Yeshua being the king of Israel, symbolically as having one wife. The creator, the king of Israel, and the law and the prophets, symbolically had one wife until polytheism entered in and whoredom and transgressions entered in, and then it mutated into polygamy. Now we're almost out of here now. I just want to read a couple of more historical documents to you. Historical documents. Because I said in the beginning, what we were dealing with was this. The writers of the New Testament. And we were showing you that to eliminate all of this antagonism, this social unrest, that the apostles taught us in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Furthermore, it teaches us in the book of Timothy. In the book of Timothy, it continues. And I know that people say we'll probably address it, but 1 Samuel says that God said that David could have two wives, more than one wife. Read that to me. It don't say that. It says, in essence, I gave you the kingdom and your master's wives. And I would have gave you, and if you wanted anything else, I would have gave you such and such. He never said he would give David more wives, because he done already established in the kingdom that the king should not multiply wives. So that don't fly. You got to do a little bit better than that. Now look, but one thing the record do show in 2 Samuel chapter 12 is that because of the hierarchy, polygamy ravaged the society, and therefore the king overstepped the boundaries, turned away, just like the Almighty said, and then took another man's wife. See, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says a king should not multiply wives lest he turn away. It didn't specify he was going to turn away because his wife was going to worship other gods like Solomon. It didn't specify that. It just said his heart shall turn away. Every example of a king in Israel who had multiple wives, they all turned away. Is that a coincidence? I mean, every single one of them that gives us a record of him having more than one wife. The records. Okay, if other kings had more than one wife, it didn't give us a record, we don't know. But the record of the kings that had more than one wife, they all turned away. However, the difference with David, David turned away. That's why he committed the monstrosity with Bathsheba. Okay? He turned away from the way. The Creator didn't say what this will, how it will cause them to turn away. It just said it will cause them to turn away. David did it. Saul turned away. He was the first king, had multiple wives. David turned away and repented. And then the harems and all of his extra wives committed adultery and fornication with his sons. His sons had a perilous relationship because one son from one wife wanted his sister from another wife, and they started to act the fool. So we find that the scandals in David's kingdom arose out of polygamy. We also find that Solomon turned away multiple wives. His son Rehoboam turned away multiple wives. Ahab turned away multiple wives. Josiah started on a good foot, and the priest gave him 2 wives, mainly possibly because the seed royal was killed off by the queen, by the previous queen. They had to hide Josiah. So to repopulate, the priest gave him 2 wives, but the Bible, the law said don't multiply wives. And Josiah turned away too. The Bible seemed to teach us exactly what the Bible said will happen. 2 sisters being vexed if you marry both in the same lifetime. Showing us exactly what the Bible warned us about in polygamy has been revealed in the Bible and also revealed in secular knowledge. So we turn to Titus or 1 Timothy, because it said in Corinthians, I'm sorry, I went to talking, but in Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 2, 1 Corinthians 7 and 2, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband, or each woman having her own husband, each woman having his own wife, right? That keeps down everything we've been reading today. It eliminates all this antagonism and feuds in the world. And we're going to prove it to you a little bit more before we close out. Now we go forward to the book of Timothy. 1 Timothy, it reads, 1 Timothy 3 and 2, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach. Not giving a wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler or covetousness. And he must rule his house, having his children in subjection and with all gravity. Well, you know, it's been proven that in a polygamous relationship, the dissension and unrest is apparent, and conflict, according to the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, conflict and dissension is apparent in polygamous relationships. So to have his household ruled well would be a challenge in a polygamous relationship when you find that polygamy brings forth conflicts. Polygamy brings forth conflicts among women and children. Studies have shown this. It reads in this book, Perils of Polygamy, in this article, Perils of Polygamy, by Christopher Coxor. It teaches us that in a monogamous society, notice this, because Paul said, let every woman have her own husband, and every wife have her Let every man have his own wife, every woman have her own husband. Let the bishop be the husband of one wife and rule his house well. I know they say Mia means first or one. Exactly. Mia means first or one. How do you determine? By the context. We know by the spirit of the context of Paul's argument, he's talking about one. Because multiple wives cause conflict. We also know, if we compare it with Corinthians, he said, let every woman have her own husband. This eliminates co-wives. You can't have your own husband if he's shared with another woman. So here we understand what Paul's explaining. Not he got to be the husband of his first wife, because two is this would eliminate a man whose wife left him. Let's say he was into the gospel and his first wife leaves him. Does that mean he can't be a bishop? No. Paul not talking about he got to be the husband of his first wife. He's saying he got to be husband of one wife, because polygamy causes problems in the household. Who else had to be the husband of one wife? If we skip down in this same chapter, chapter 12, let the deacons be the husband of one wife, ruling their children and their houses well. You see how ruling the house well is accompanied or attached to monogamy? Now, if you look at this as monogamy and ruling the house well, keeping down strife and monogamy, ruling the household and the children well, in contrast to polygamy, this will fit. Look at this. Notice this. Given roughly equal numbers of males and females as found in nature, polygamy and monogamy shape society. Notice this. Polygamy and monogamy shape society in radically different ways. In a monogamous society, for each man there is a corresponding woman. William Tucker notes that this gives every man and every woman reasonable chance to mate. By contrast, in a polygamous society, some men take multiple wives, but this leaves other men with greatly diminished prospects of marriage or exclusion from mating altogether. Wait a minute. This causes inequality among men finding wives. Notice this. In their 2012 article, The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage, which we're going to look into before we close out, appearing in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, Joseph Henrich, Robert Boyd, and Peter J. Richardson used converging lines of evidence from the social sciences to compare polygamous and monogamous societies. They found that polygamous societies differ from monogamous societies in terms of violent crimes and domestic violence. So we're saying ruling the house well, that'll be a problem if you got domestic violence, wouldn't it? Ruling the house well and raising your children would be a problem as well. For example, what we read earlier about the problem between the women trying to secure resources between the children. Notice this, because he said, and have your children subject in all gravity. Notice, co-wives conflict is ubiquitous in polygynous households. So if we're looking at Paul admonishing the people to rule their households well, we find co-wife conflict is ubiquitous in polygynous households from Anthropology Review of Ethnographic Data. 69, we read this earlier, non-soil polygynous societies from around the globe reveals no case where co-wife relations could be described as harmonious. These conflicts leads to polygamous family units. These conflicts leads polygamous family units particularly those with 3 or more wives, to have general higher rates of divorce than monogamous couples. In the supplementary materials to their article, Henry, Boyd, and Richardson point out systematic and controlled analysis of polygynous societies generally show higher divorce rates for polygynous versus polygamous marriages in the same society. So if you're going to rule your house well and have children, we have found, according to the Bible, yes, conflict arises out of polygamy. So the spirit of what we have been reading teaches us that Paul is talking about one wife. It eliminates the conflict. It teaches us about domestic violence. A man can't rule his house well with a bunch of domestic violence. A bishop or a deacon can't rule his house well. He can't be a striker with domestic violence. It also reveals in polygamous relationships something else. Because notice what Paul is naming. He got to be sober. They got to be sober, can't be given to wine, ruling their house and their children well. Where we find in that there's higher rates of a divorce in polygamous relationships. Relative to monogamous families, polygamous families with more than 2 wives are 5 times more likely to divorce. As bad as polygamy is for women, so as far as ruling your house well, as far as the women it's a problem, but notice this, even worse for the well-being of children. And we're learning that Paul is telling them to raise your children well. Well, polygamy is even worse for children. Look at this. The children suffer also from having multiple stepmothers, involved in ongoing struggles with each other that we've been reading in the Bible, which the Bible supports. Half siblings must compete for limited resources, while having weaker genetic bonds to mitigate the conflict. While these extended family relationships could in theory be a source of support, more often they endanger children, Henrik study explains. Much empirical work in monogamous societies indicate, in other words, evidence, empirical evidence, shows we have seen it. It's not just a theory. Much empirical work in monogamous societies indicate that higher degrees of relatedness among household members are associated with lower rates of abuse. In other words, keeping your house in order. It is associated with lower rates in neglect and homicide. Living in the same household with genetically unrelated adults is the single biggest risk factor for abuse, neglect, and homicide of children. Look at this here, brothers and sisters. Now, what we are learning is that if Paul is teaching the bishop and the deacon to rule their house well, to have their children raised with all gravity and subjection, then we learn through biblical evidence about the conflict in families in polygamous relationships, the conflict among children and wives. We're learning also the conflict in secular, historical, documented, eyewitness, empirical evidence of how polygamy will undermine what Paul is explaining to Timothy. It will undermine what Paul explained to the Corinthians. On contrast, this undermines what Paul is saying, one wife, each woman have her own husband. This, in contrast, undermines polygamy. This undermines polygamy. What else have we found? Notice this. We have a lot of documentations. I try to put enough out there so people can look at it and study it. So we're going to skip some because of the time. And we have more information on our other video. So when we're looking at polygamy, we're going to finish off The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage by Joseph Henrich, Robert Boyd, and Peter J. Richardson, where we was quoting from out of this other article on Public Discourse, The Perils of Polygamy. We have the original article where they were quoting from, and you can actually find it and download it online. Philosophical transcripts. Okay, The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage. Now, I established something in the beginning about monogamy. How monogamy was found in the early society of Adam. And how that early society of Adam, there was no hierarchy. And that in Genesis, the first chapter, it teaches us that man and woman was to be heirs of the world. Man did not have to provide the means for women because women were freely able to provide as they shared the resources and shared the responsibilities of ruling the world. All women, all men. There wasn't any hierarchy. Now, I argue that this laid the foundation of an egalitarian society, which existed in the early society until it was undermined by the development of Cain and his establishing of hierarchy and in his children establishing polygyny. Look, brothers and sisters. According to this review, the anthropological record indicates that approximately 85% of human societies have permitted men to have more than one wife. Polygamous marriage. And both empirical and evolutionary considerations suggest that large absolute differences in wealth should favor more polygynous marriages. So polygyny is actually also being raised by the forms of hierarchy and wealth. The Bible proved that it was only among the wealthy people that had multiple wives. So if you look at the majority of Israelites, didn't have multiple wives because the majority of them wasn't wealthy. And then in the society where there isn't any wealth and there's egalitarian relations, then polygamy don't prevail. This is what they have found in these studies. But notice the equality that is established. Now we're looking at Paul. Now look, notice what else Paul has said in Titus, the first chapter. Titus. I want you to look at Titus as well, because he told Timothy and Titus, which were his students who was going to lay the foundations of the church, which is the kingdom of God, they're going to continue in that work. In Titus chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, it reads, For this cause I left thee in Crete, that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city, as I had appointed thee. If any be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly. Now, you see, all antagonisms had to be eliminated. And we learned that this makes sense in the institution of monogamy. We're going to prove this to you. It makes sense because monogamy lays the foundation of justice and equity. It is less likely to have contention. It is less likely to have unruly children. It is less likely to have dissension and contention and discord and unruliness in the household. Polygamy lays the fertile ground for the seeds of this discord. Monogamy eliminates it. That's why when he's saying one wife, he means it. And scientifically, it's proven. Empirical evidence proves what Paul is saying. Now notice this. The modern package of monogamous marriage have been favored by cultural evolution because of their group beneficial effects in suppressing intrasexual competition. Monogamous societies suppress intrasexual competition, meaning men competing for women because you got a few men taking all the women. That causes intrasexual competition, which leads to violence. So it suppresses intrasexual competition and reducing the size of the pool of unmarried men. Normative monogamy reduces crime rates, including rape, murder, assault, robbery, and fraud, as well as decreasing personal abuses that Hannah suffered, that Leah suffered, that Rachel suffered, that Hagar suffered. Normative monogamy reduces intra-household conflict, leading to lower rates of child neglect. That's why we got a rule. Paul was talking about have your children in order. That means you can't neglect them. You got to have this in order. It reduces it leads to lower rates of child neglect, child abuse, accidental death, and homicide. These predictions are tested using converging lines of evidence from across the human sciences. So this is just a theory. This has been proven. So if you're going to rule your household well, we're learning that polygamy undermines what Paul is establishing. Polygamy will destroy your household. Polygamy lays the foundation of destroying your household. Show me one household there that it wasn't contention in the scriptures. And the most you might pull out the bag is Caleb, but they don't expound on his household. But when they expound on the household of the polygamous marriages, the Bible pointing out problems. First of all, it tells you in the introduction, approximately 85% of societies in the anthropological record permit men to marry multiple wives. Taking wives is always positively associated with the status, wealth, and nobility. This is what the Bible has proven as well. As we continue, it reads, laying the foundation of Paul arguing one wife. It brings equity. It brings us back to the Genesis. So each time the Creator rebuilt the world, it was upon the foundations of monogamy. Right? So when the Creator first established the world, it was upon the foundations of monogamy. Then because of the corruption, he wiped it clean. He reestablished the foundations of the world, and he established it with monogamy. Now the kingdom of God, in essence, is another reestablishing of the world. And it's being founded, according to Paul, upon monogamy. Why? It reads in this review, the 15% or so of societies, because remember, 85% allow polygamy. So the 15% or so of societies in the anthropological record of monogamous marriage fall into two desperate categories. Small-scale societies inhabiting marginal environments with little status distinctions among males. You see what he's saying? Small-scale societies inhabiting marginal environments with little status distinction among males. There's no class distinctions. In these societies, there is monogamy. That's not a coincidence. So when there's equity among the males, that means every man has a chance to have his own wife. Every woman has a chance to have her own husband, not having to share her husband, running into a conflict that her husband might not love her because he loved the other wife. What we're learning is that the foundations in societies, anthropological record proves in monogamous societies, marriage falls into two desperate categories. One, small-scale societies with marginal environments with little status distinction among males. Now, it also teaches that ecologically imposed monogamy occurs because the societies lack sufficiently large differences in male wealth or status to motivate women to become second wives. So they even showing that when every man is on the same plane, that don't motivate one woman to chase after a rich man. You see the psychological effects of polygamy and monogamy? It's not just you reading it, it's psychological repercussions. So if you have a society where everybody on common ground, then you don't have this dissension. Why are we saying this? Because it's proven. Empirical evidence has proven this. Monogamous relationships are found in societies as virtually classless. Under Section 3, Theory of Evidence. Why Paul is saying that every woman should have her own husband, and each woman have her own husband, and every man should have his own wife, and deacons and bishops and elders be the husband of one wife. Notice this. They're laying the foundations of the kingdom. We're learning that monogamy is inherent, or monogamy is what is seen. This is a consistent thread. Monogamy is a consistent thread seen in societies where there is virtually no class differences. That's how it was in Genesis. No class differences. What was there? Monogamy. When class differences arose, what arose? Polygamy. When class differences was destroyed and Noah began to repopulate the earth, what was there? Monogamy. When class differences began to arise again, what arose? Polygamy. Now the Creator going to destroy the world as we know it, lay the foundations of a new world right now, and among the participants of the new covenant, what's being laid? What foundations are being laid? Monogamy. To bring forth a classless society. In relatively egalitarian societies, including most foreigners, relatively egalitarian societies, including most foragers, the social implications of polygamous marriages are minor. Few men in these societies achieve sufficient status to attract additional wives. You see how they're saying psychologically, women also gravitates towards the man with the wealth. So, in some sense, women don't mind the institution of polygamy of the man rich. But that don't justify the institution of polygamy. Just like the institution of slavery. Some slaves didn't mind being slaves. They had a good rich master, right? So just because it was an exception to the rule, you had a slave who had a good rich master who treated him good and let him live in an attic, probably gave him his own room. Does that justify the institutions of slavery? No. What disqualifies the institutions of slavery? Inequality. It cannot be inherent in the kingdom of God. What is consistent in polygamy? Strife, contention, seditions, and inequality among the family, and inequality among the social status of the men who acquire these wives, thereby depriving other men of wives. It continues. As the wealth and inequality of societies increase over the course of societal evolution, notice carefully, as wealth and inequality increase in society, our evolved psychology operating within group cultural evolutionary processes increased the degree of polygynous marriage among the richest and most powerful men. Inequality. Paul knew if every man didn't have his own wife and every woman didn't have her own husband, this could cause problems among certain men who could take all of the women then causing women contention among themselves, contention among the children. Can't be in the kingdom. And that's why we say in this school, it can't be. We continue, excuse me. When males face more reproductive competition than females, the larger 1 to male, 1 female ratio, the fiercer is the competition. Of course. We dealt with this in the other segment. This is why so much war prevailing in polygamous societies. This is proven. Opportunities for sexual selection, mate contemplation are 6 to 4 times greater in societies lacking normative monogamy. It's likely that, man, it's competition. You're trying to find a woman because you got one guy taking all the women. You got a few men, a percentage of men, 10% of the men in society taking all of the women because they rich. And there's no regulation in the Torah, so how many women do you get? One man, 700 wives? 800 concubines? 100 wives? This combination of longitudinal and cross-sectional evidence converges to suggest that normative monogamy does indeed reduce intrasexual competition. It reduces it. That means competing for a bride is reduced in monogamous relationships. One important implication of suppressing intrasexual competition should be to reduce crime. By expanding the pool of unmarried men and elevating the degree of intrasexual competition, more polygynous marriages will increase men's discounting of the future and risk-taking, resulting in more socially undesirable behaviors. Reuben sleeping with his mother's wife. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, a man sleeping with his father's wife. Remember the dynamics. Father being older, he could be in his 40s or 50s. Bride being in his 20s. And his older son in his 20s. It can breed problems. The Mormons and other societies and religious societies have proven this. The older men take the younger women, the desirable women, which causes conflicts among the unmarried men in these organizations and communities. This is proven. This is not of the Creator. He did not command polygamy. He tolerated it. He did not command that you have a king. He tolerated it. Look, faced with high levels of intrasexual competition and little chance of obtaining even one long-term mate, unmarried, low-status men will heavily discount the future and more readily engage in risky, status-elevating, and sex-seeking behaviors. You see that? Sex-seeking behaviors. What happened to the man in Corinthians? He lay with his father's wife. Is this more prone to take place in a polygamous environment? Yes. What happened with Jacob? Reuben took his father's concubine. And it's likely that the concubine was closer to Reuben's age than Jacob's age. Is this proven? And has it been proven in polygamous societies that the children are, or the single men are more likely to seek sex-seeking behaviors that will cause fornication and adultery? It's been proven. Nevertheless, normative monogamy drains the pool of low-status unmarried men, resulting in lower rates of social ills, including reduced rates of crime, social disruption, and substance abuse. See what that's doing? Why does it make sense for Paul to say let every man have his own wife? Let every woman have her own husband? Why is he telling the elders and the deacons to be examples? Have one wife because monogamy drains the pool of low status unmarried men, resulting in lower cases of social ills, including reduced rates of crime, social disruption, and substance abuse. It also reduces the rate of or it practically eliminates the rates of intramarital, or should I say, as we look at this, intrasexual competition. Men competing with one another for the woman. You might find this in your little Israelite groups, especially those who want to allow polygamy. You get one guy, he got is already trying to find a sister or a man in the scriptures. Next thing you know, you get a guy in the scriptures who want the other women. You understand? No sooner than a young woman walking through the doors, he acting a damn fool because he's not satisfied with his one wife. And don't let him be a little older. You got young sisters coming in there. Instead of hoping that this young woman to find a young husband so that they can enjoy one another, you got these guys want to jump onto the young women. If it's so much about building community and so much of a care for the women, why don't you find older women? Older women. But that's a whole nother subject. The argument is trash. And the critical analysis of these polygamous arguments is trash. And it deserves to be where it needs to be. And the garbage. And that's what we're saying. Take out the garbage. Now look what we're looking at this here. By contrast, normative monogamy means that no one is shut out and increases in a man's relative status and increases in a man's relative status does not increase his number of long-term mates. Several converging lines of evidence indicate that monogamous marriages reduce crime. So when we're looking at what Paul is arguing, the benefits of monogamy, complements Genesis. It complements the kingdom of God. Equity, peace, justice. Monogamy has been proven, empirical evidence, research, biblical evidence from empirical resources that I would say that there was eyewitnesses, proves this argument that monogamy brings or lays the foundation of a more just society. That's what you find in Genesis. Adam and Eve. Noah and his sons, all one wives. Essenes talked about Adam and Eve and Noah. All the animals repopulated the earth with one mate. It all lays the groundwork for a just egalitarian society which the kingdom of God is founded upon. Polygamy, in contrast, creates contention, strife, inequality among the women, inequality among the children. It is an institution that is practiced by the inequality in a society when one man has more of a social status and wealth than another man. Therefore, he creates an inequality among the selection of women, causing intrasexual competition where now poor men are competing for a wife because the wives are drawn or also taken to the rich men. That institution itself cannot sustain a society, and it is not an institution in which Paul was laying the groundwork for the kingdom of God. The results across 6 different model specifications show that the greater the degree of polygamy or polygyny across nations, the higher the percentage of unmarried men. Research has seen this. The more polygamy, the higher percentage of unmarried men. And you see this monstrosity going on now. You see the fruits of it, or should I say the bastardized version of polygamy, is when you got one guy messing around, sleeping around with all the different women. And therefore, this turns the whole society into whoredom. That's the bastardized version of it. One man may got money, He may have, just like they say about the dealers and guys who got money, all of the women of the neighborhood flock to him because he got money. All of the poor people in the neighborhood, they try and do what they need to do to get some women, sell drugs, shoot one another, get the best reputation because they're in conflict because they want a wife. This is natural. But nowadays they want a girlfriend. But that's because they've been distorted in this male chauvinist bastard society or this civilization that marriage and everything is out the window. And the bastardized form of polygamy prevails in the name of fornication. And what we see, conflict, men dying, men polluting multiple women, having multiple children, children in conflict with one another. It's all chaos. And it takes the servants of God through the grace of the Almighty to sit down at the table and begin to divide and put in order all of this chaos. In contrast, as we have read, that the percentage shows that the more polygamy across the nations, the higher percentage of unmarried men. We also read that polygynous societies engage in more warfare, often with the goal of capturing women. And this is proven too. You can look it up in Economist magazine, just an example out of the South Sudan, and you will find this in other places. Polygamy causes warfare. Those societies to this day, the polygamists who allow polygamy, their environments and society and civilization are thrust in turmoil, strife, and warfare. Turbulent. So, now we're learning what is happening again with polygamy. It tells us that polygamous marriage will increase conflict within households because it creates competition among co-wives, reduces paternity certainty, which increases male sexual jealousy, allocations of household resources to other wives' children mean fewer resources for one's own children. So we're seeing all of the conflicts that arise. It creates competition among co-wives and reduces paternity certainty. Paternity certainty, meaning which increases his male sexual jealousies. Okay? Now, on the contrast, normative monogamy eliminates conflicts between co-wives. So when Paul's saying let every woman have her own husband, every man have his own wife, because it's been shown, normative monogamy eliminates, meaning not monogamy where a husband or a wife acting a damn fool, but normative monogamy like Adam, like Noah and his wife, eliminates conflict between co-wives, decreases child abuse, neglect, and homicide, which will fulfill what Paul is explaining, that the bishop or the deacon must rule his own house well, having his children in subjection with all gravity. So monogamy creates the environment for that. It decreases child abuse, neglect, and homicide by increasing the means of relatedness in households and reducing the number of unrelated child dyads. Co-wife conflict is ubiquitous in polygamous households. This is what we read earlier. Co-wife conflicts is ubiquitous. It's all over in polygamy, right? Normative monogamy may reduce spousal homicide, domestic violence, the use of physical coercion by decreasing the spousal age gap, gender inequality, paternal uncertainty, and mate competition. It reduces inequality of the genders. It reduces intrasexual competition, which is mate competition. Research indicates that both spousal age gaps and paternity uncertainty are important predictors of spousal homicides. So it reduces domestic violence, maternal mortality, and it also reduces sex trafficking. Monogamy. So we are going to conclude today about monogamy. As Paul said, as these studies have shown, the elimination of inequality, the elimination of spousal homicides and disorder and conflict in the houses, the elimination of children finding themselves in fornication, in sex trafficking, the elimination of abuse and neglect, the elimination of conflict between wives and children, the elimination of a son not being or not having the relationship with his father because the father got too many wives and too many children. It reads in some documents, some monogamous families, the father don't even know all his children's names. He don't even know their name. So that's just like a mother raising a son alone. Like Hagar raised a child alone for the most part, a single parent. I'm sure she had, in that society, she had support. Abraham sent support. But could she even marry again? Was she put away? All of these are questions people don't ask. But to eliminate all of that discord and contention, Paul tells us, and he tells Timothy, that in 1 Timothy, what should happen? Chapter 2, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality and apt to teach. All that internal marital conflict couldn't be there. But polygamy brings it. Not given to wine nor a striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous. One that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. The deacons, same thing. Let the deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children, their household well. This is found on the foundations of monogamy. And we're going to close out for this segment. He's not talking about Mia. He got to be the husband of his first wife. That trashy argument is thrown to the damn gutter once we understand the spirit and do a careful analysis of the psychology and the empirical data of societies in polygamous relationships opposed or in contrast or in juxtaposition to monogamous societies. It is the monogamous society that correlates well for the establishing of the kingdom of God, and also it makes perfect sense for it to always have been the foundations of the building of the society of God. In Genesis with Adam, in Genesis with Noah, and in this new society under the new covenant, it's the same foundations being laid, monogamy. I thank you for your time. It's been a long discourse, but we find it needful to put it out there for your own studies. So until the next time, my brother Judah signing out with the Knesset. Lord willing, we'll be able to come to you again with teachings. Until that time, we say shalom to you all. And may the Almighty bless your understanding, all of you who are searching sincerely for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.